There is a place on this earth where the ground itself remembers things that human civilization has not yet found the courage to admit. A place so vast, so ancient, and so strangely silent that walking across it feels less like crossing a landscape and more like moving through the surface of a forgotten dream. The Australian Outback stretches for nearly 6 million square kilometres of red earth, wind-carved stone, and sky so wide it seems to belong to a different planet entirely. Most people who think about it at all picture emptiness, dust, heat shimmer on the horizon, maybe a solitary road cutting through nothing toward more nothing. But the scientists who have spent their careers digging into that red earth, reading the rock formations, studying the strange artifacts that keep rising to the surface, and listening to the knowledge systems of people whose ancestors walked this land for tens of thousands of years, those scientists are not seeing emptiness at all. They are seeing something that quietly terrifies the part of the human mind that needs history to stay neat and predictable and contained. They are seeing evidence that the story we tell about Australia, about human prehistory, and about the ancient world is missing chapters so large and so significant that everything we think we know might need to be read again from the beginning. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I check every comment, and there is something genuinely moving about seeing someone in Perth at midnight, someone in London at dawn, someone in Texas in the middle of a sleepless Tuesday, all watching the same story about the red earth on the other side of the world, all wondering about the same ancient silence. The finds have been accumulating for decades now, quietly piling up in university archives, in the back rooms of regional museums, in the field notes of researchers who published carefully worded papers, and then spent years watching those papers get ignored, dismissed, or buried under the weight of institutional inertia. A carved stone here, an underground chamber there, symbols on rock faces that match symbols found on the other side of the world, skeletal remains that don't fit any migration timeline anyone was comfortable with. Geological formations that look less like nature's work and more like something built by minds that understood engineering on a scale we are still trying to wrap our heads around. Each individual find could be explained away, a coincidence, an erosion pattern, a misidentification. But when you lay them all out together, when you trace the pattern from the deep south to the tropical north, from the ancient coastal shelves to the dead center of the continent, where Uluru rises from the earth like a monument to geological memory, the coincidences stop being coincidences and start being something else. They start being a story. And that story begins, as so many Australian stories do, with the land itself. The Australian continent is the oldest exposed landmass on the surface of the earth. That is not a poetic claim. That is a geological fact that scientists have measured with instruments sensitive enough to date individual mineral crystals to within a few million years of their formation. Parts of Western Australia contain rock formations that are over 4 billion years old, older than the oceans that exist today, older than the oxygen in the atmosphere, older than the biological processes that eventually produced the first single-celled life in the ancient seas. When geologists talk about the age of Australian bedrock, they are using timescales that make the rise and fall of every human civilization, every dynasty, every empire, every city, every language, every technology, seem like something that happened in the last fraction of a second before midnight on a clock that has been running since the dawn of the solar system. But it is not the age of the rock that troubles the researchers. Ancient rock is ancient rock. What troubles them is what the rock contains, and what has been found in the spaces beneath it. In 2016, a team of geologists working in the Yilgarn-Creighton region of Western Australia made a discovery that circulated briefly in the scientific press, and then settled quietly into the category of things that get discussed at conferences in hushed tones rather than announced on the front pages of newspapers. They had been conducting a routine survey of the subsurface using ground-penetrating radar, the same technology that archaeologists use to look for buried structures, and that engineers use to check for underground utilities before they start digging. The images that came back from the survey showed something nobody had included in the project's expected findings. Beneath the surface, at depths ranging from 3 to 12 meters, there were what appeared to be constructed chambers, not natural caves, not the result of erosion or geological folding, but spaces with what the radar indicated were flat floors, angular walls, and in some cases, what looked like deliberate connecting passages. The team did what scientists do when they find something that doesn't fit the existing model. They ran the survey again, and then again, and the images kept showing the same thing. The problem with underground structures in a region that has been inhabited by the same cultural group for at least 65,000 years is that they don't fit neatly into any archaeological framework that has been built around the assumption that pre-colonial Australia was home exclusively to nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples who built no permanent structures and left no physical marks on the landscape beyond rock art and stone tool deposits. That assumption is not just wrong. As the evidence from the past 3 decades has been making increasingly clear, it is catastrophically, almost embarrassingly wrong. But the framework built around it is old, and old frameworks are heavy things to move. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have never described themselves as people without architecture, without engineering, or without a sophisticated relationship to the physical landscape of the continent. The Dreamtime, that extraordinarily complex cosmological and epistemological system that underpins Aboriginal culture across hundreds of distinct language groups, is not a collection of fairy stories about supernatural beings who created rivers and mountains out of divine whimsy. It is, as an increasing number of researchers from fields ranging from geology to astronomy to cognitive science have begun to argue, a knowledge system of extraordinary depth and precision, one that encodes real geographical information, real astronomical data, real ecological patterns, and real historical memory in a form that can survive transmission across thousands of generations without losing its essential content. When an Aboriginal elder from the Arabana people describes a Dreamtime journey that crosses the landscape in a specific sequence of locations and geographic features, and a geologist then maps that sequence against the actual topography of the region, what they find is not mythology. What they find is a map, an accurate, detailed, and in some cases extraordinarily ancient map of the physical world. And some of those maps describe things beneath the ground. The Adnyamathanha people of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia have maintained oral traditions for as long as anyone has been paying attention that describe a network of underground passages connecting specific sacred sites across hundreds of kilometers of country. For most of the 20th century, these accounts were catalogued by anthropologists as spiritual narratives, stories about the movements of ancestral beings in a metaphorical underworld. And then, hydrogeologists mapping the Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest and oldest underground water systems on the planet, began discovering that the geological reality of the subsurface in the Flinders Ranges includes exactly the kind of interconnected passages and chambers that the Adnyamathanha oral traditions had been describing all along. Not in the same spiritual language, obviously. The geology papers talked about paleochannel networks, karst formations, and ancient aquifer systems. But the spatial relationships, the connections between specific surface locations and specific underground features, match the oral traditions with a precision that was difficult to attribute to coincidence. This is where the story starts to get uncomfortable for the kind of history that gets taught in schools. Because the most natural explanation for that kind of match between an oral tradition and a geological reality is that the oral tradition was constructed by people who had direct knowledge of that geological reality. People who had explored those underground systems. People who had mapped them, understood them, and encoded that understanding in a form that could be passed down through hundreds, possibly thousands of generations. And the age of those geological features, the paleochannel networks and karst formations, goes back not hundreds of years, but hundreds of thousands of years, which means we are potentially looking at knowledge that has been maintained and transmitted across a span of time that makes every other recorded human tradition look like something written yesterday. But the underground chambers and the encoded geological knowledge are only the beginning of what the Red Earth has been giving up. In 1992, in a remote area of Queensland that most maps don't bother to name, a cattleman named Rex Gilroy found a series of stone arrangements that he initially assumed were a natural feature of the landscape. The stones were large, some of them weighing several tons, and they were arranged in a pattern that followed a specific geometric logic across an area of about 3 hectares. Gilroy was not an archaeologist, but he was a careful observer, and what he noticed was that the pattern could not be accounted for by any natural process he was aware of. The stones had been selected, and they appeared to have been moved because the type of rock they were made from did not match the geological substrate of the surrounding area. They were, in other words, imported, brought from somewhere else, and arranged according to a plan. When Gilroy reported his find and eventually attracted the attention of researchers with more formal credentials, the investigation that followed over the next several years produced a set of findings that have never been satisfactorily explained within the conventional framework of Australian prehistory. The arrangement appeared to include alignments with specific stellar rising and setting points, not one or two coincidental alignments which could easily be dismissed, but a systematic set of orientations that corresponded to astronomical events across multiple seasons and multiple centuries, suggesting that whoever built the arrangement had been maintaining it, adjusting it, and refining it over a very long period of time. This was not the first time stone arrangements with astronomical significance had been found in Australia. The Wurdi stone arrangement in Victoria, a large egg-shaped collection of stones that has since been formally studied and recognized as a genuine archaeological site, was analyzed in the early 2000s by a team that included archaeologists, astronomers, and indigenous knowledge holders from the Wathaurong people, whose ancestors are believed to have created it. The analysis found that specific stones within the arrangement marked the positions of the setting sun at the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the two equinoxes with an accuracy that, given the size of the arrangement and the limitations of naked eye observation, implied a sophisticated program of long-term astronomical observation and recording. The age of the arrangement has never been definitively established, because stone arrangements are notoriously difficult to date with precision. But the geological evidence and the degree of weathering on the stones suggested an age of at least 10,000 years, and possibly significantly more. 10,000 years ago, the last ice age had just ended. The sea levels around Australia were still rising, drowning the continental shelf that had once connected the continent to New Guinea and creating the coastlines we recognize today. The people who built Wurdi were living in a world that looked very different from the one their descendants would inhabit, and they were apparently conducting systematic astronomical observations and encoding the results in permanent stone structures. This does not fit comfortably into the narrative that describes the Aboriginal peoples as groups who left no lasting physical mark on the Australian landscape, who built no permanent structures, and who had no technology beyond hand tools. But it fits extremely well into the narrative that the Aboriginal peoples have been trying to tell about themselves for as long as anyone has been present and willing to listen. And then there is the question of the Egyptian connection, which is where the story takes a turn that a significant portion of the scientific establishment would prefer to pretend doesn't exist. In 1992, near the town of Gosford on the central coast of New South Wales, a set of inscriptions carved into a sandstone cliff face that had been known locally since at least the 1970s attracted the attention of a pair of researchers who were sufficiently unusual in their academic backgrounds to look at the carvings without the filter of what they were supposed to see. The carvings covered approximately 250 square meters of cliff surface and consisted of what appeared to be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics mixed with a series of other symbols that didn't match any known writing system from any part of the ancient world. The initial response from the mainstream Egyptological community was dismissal. The carvings were pronounced modern fakes, the work of enthusiastic amateurs or deliberate hoaxes, and that judgment stuck for decades, partly because the site had not been formally excavated, and partly because the idea of ancient Egyptians in Australia was so far outside the accepted historical framework that almost no researcher with a career to protect was willing to seriously investigate the claim. But the carvings kept attracting attention, and the investigation that eventually emerged from outside the mainstream academic channels produced findings that are substantially more complicated than the fake label suggests. Analysis of the patination on the carved surfaces, the chemical weathering layer that forms over exposed rock over time, showed in multiple independent tests that the carvings were not modern. The weathering patterns were consistent with an age of at least several centuries and possibly much longer. Analysis of the carving technique showed that the tools used to create the inscriptions had produced groove profiles inconsistent with any modern cutting implement. And most significantly, analysis of the actual content of the hieroglyphics by researchers with genuine Egyptological training produced an interpretation of part of the text that described an expedition that had sailed to a distant southern land and suffered casualties, including a significant leader of the group, whose death was recorded in the inscriptions. Now, this is the point where reasonable skepticism is not just appropriate, but necessary. There are multiple alternative explanations for each individual element of the Gosford glyphs, as they have come to be called. Ancient weathering patterns can be produced by specific local environmental conditions that don't necessarily indicate the age people think they indicate. Carving groove profiles can vary based on the hardness of the rock and the technique of the carver, and the interpretation of any ancient inscription is filtered through the knowledge, assumptions, and sometimes the desires of the researcher doing the interpreting. The Gosford glyphs could be an elaborate hoax created several centuries ago by someone with surprising Egyptological knowledge. They could be the product of some forgotten early colonial experiment. They could be genuine ancient Egyptian inscriptions. The evidence, honestly assessed, does not definitively prove any of these possibilities. What it does do is refuse to be neatly dismissed. And the reason the dismissal has been so persistent and so reflexive is not because the evidence is clearly fraudulent, but because the implications of the alternative are so enormous that they would require not just a revision of Australian history, but a wholesale reconstruction of everything we think we know about ancient maritime capability, ancient trade routes, and the limits of what early human civilizations were technically capable of. Because if ancient Egyptians did reach Australia, they didn't get there by accident. The distance from Egypt to the Australian coast, sailing around the southern tip of Africa, or through the Indian Ocean trade routes, is not a voyage you complete without sophisticated navigation, substantial vessels, accumulated geographical knowledge, and either very good luck or a very good map, which raises the question of where the map came from. And that question leads back to the Red Earth and to the people who have been walking across it for 65,000 years, and to the possibility that the ancient world knew about Australia long before any European navigator supposedly discovered it. The history of pre-European contact with Australia is, when you actually look at the evidence rather than the orthodox narrative, not a blank page. It is a palimpsest, a surface that has been written on, erased, and written on again multiple times, with the original inscriptions showing through the erasures in ways that the people doing the erasing have spent considerable effort not seeing. The Macassan contact is the most officially acknowledged example. For at least several centuries before European colonization, and possibly much longer, traders from the port of Makassar in what is now Sulawesi, Indonesia, made annual voyages to the northern coast of Australia to harvest sea cucumbers, also known as trepang, for the Chinese market. These were not casual fishing trips. They were large-scale organized commercial operations involving fleets of vessels, hundreds of men, established shore camps, and long-term relationships with Aboriginal communities along the Arnhem Land coast. The evidence for this contact is everywhere in the archaeological record of northern Australia, in the soil chemistry of campsites that show traces of tamarind trees brought by the Macassans are now naturalized in the landscape, in rock art that depicts Macassan vessels with their distinctive proa design, in Aboriginal vocabularies that include Macassan loanwords for objects and concepts that arrived with the traders, and in oral traditions that remember the traders with the kind of specific detail that comes from direct experience rather than second-hand account. The Macassan contact was effectively known and acknowledged in the historical record by the early 20th century and has never been seriously disputed, but the Macassan contact extended back further than most people realize. Linguistic analysis suggests that the borrowing of Macassan words into Aboriginal languages along the northern coast began not decades but centuries before the most recent period of contact, and the sea cucumber trade that the Macassans were supplying to Chinese merchants was itself part of a maritime trade network that connected the eastern coast of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and China in a web of commercial relationships that was already ancient by the time the Portuguese showed up in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century and decided they had discovered it. The question that this raises, and that the scholars of pre-European Australian history have been quietly wrestling with for several decades, is how far back that maritime network reached, and who else, apart from the Macassans, might have been including Australia in their sailing range. The answer that the evidence keeps pointing toward is both simpler and stranger than most people expect. There is a tree that grows along the coast of Queensland. You might walk past it without noticing it because it looks to an untrained eye like dozens of other coastal trees in the tropical north. But the people who study plant genetics and biogeography have noticed something about this tree that doesn't fit the conventional picture of Australian flora. Its closest relatives are not found anywhere else in Australia. They are found, in significant wild populations, on the coast of West Africa, in the river estuaries of the Congo Basin, and in the marshy lowlands of coastal India. The tree is not a recent introduction. Its genetic divergence from its closest relatives is measured in tens of thousands of years, which means it either arrived in Australia by an extraordinary accident of natural dispersal, carried by ocean currents or birds across thousands of kilometers of open water, or it arrived with people who were traveling between Australia and the other continents where its relatives are found, at a time that the genetic evidence places well outside any accepted framework for ancient maritime contact. This is not an isolated anomaly. Botanists studying the distribution of food plants in northern Australia have identified multiple species whose natural ranges, when mapped, describe patterns that are much easier to explain by assuming regular human-assisted dispersal across ocean routes than by assuming purely natural spread. Some of these plants are cultivars, varieties that show clear signs of selective pressure associated with human cultivation, which means that someone was growing them deliberately and carrying them from place to place. In a continent where the official history says agriculture was never practiced before European settlement, the presence of cultivated plant varieties with genetic relationships to crops grown in Southeast Asia, India, and Africa is something that requires explanation, and the explanations that the botanical evidence actually supports are not comfortable ones for the traditional historical narrative. But the plants are not the strangest things that the Red Earth has been giving up. In 1945, during the construction of a road through a remote area of the Northern Territory, workers uncovered a series of large stones that had been arranged in a specific pattern and buried under approximately 2 meters of soil. The find was reported to the relevant authorities, was recorded in a local government file, and was then forgotten for 60 years until a researcher going through archival material in the Darwin Library in 2007 came across the original report and went back to the site to see what, if anything, remained. What he found was that the road construction had disturbed only part of the original arrangement. The rest was still intact, still buried, and still arranged in the same pattern described in the 1945 report. When the site was eventually excavated with proper archaeological methodology, the stones were found to be sitting on a prepared surface, a layer of fine compressed gravel that had clearly been laid deliberately as a foundation. They were arranged in what appeared to be a systematic pattern that, when analyzed by a geologist familiar with the rock types of the Northern Territory, revealed that the stones had not come from anywhere in the immediate vicinity. They had been transported from sources at least 60 kilometers away, and beneath the prepared surface, embedded in undisturbed geological deposits, were fragments of charcoal that radiocarbon dating placed at somewhere between 38,000 and 42,000 years before the present. 42,000 years. That is more than twice the age of Stonehenge. It predates the earliest accepted evidence for monumental construction anywhere else on the planet. It places the creation of this buried stone arrangement in an era when the rest of the human world was still, according to the conventional timeline, in the very early stages of developing the behavioral complexity that would eventually lead to civilization. And it sits in the middle of Australia, in a region that the official history of that continent says was home to nomadic hunter-gatherers who left no permanent structures. The charcoal dates were questioned, as such dates always are when they produce unexpected results. The samples were retested at a different laboratory. The dates held. They were tested again using a different radiometric method. The dates held. The researcher who excavated the site published his findings in a peer-reviewed geological journal. Not an archaeological one, because the geological evidence was what he was most confident in, and because the archaeological establishment's response to his preliminary inquiries had been less than encouraging. The paper attracted modest attention in specialist circles, was cited a handful of times in subsequent literature on the archaeology of Northern Australia, and then settled into the comfortable obscurity that seems to be the natural fate of findings that don't fit the consensus framework. But the date itself remained in the record, undisputed in its technical accuracy even by those who disputed its implications. 42,000 years. Deliberately transported stones, a prepared foundation surface, in central Australia. Now, here is what you need to understand about the broader context in which this kind of finding sits, because without that context, it's easy to see individual anomalies as isolated curiosities, rather than as parts of a coherent pattern. The Australian Outback is not a blank canvas. It is not a geological and archaeological void in which scattered anomalies are waiting to be explained. It is a landscape saturated with evidence of human activity across timescales that are, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The problem is not that the evidence doesn't exist. The problem is that the framework for interpreting it has been shaped by 2 centuries of assumptions, and those assumptions are now cracking under the pressure of what the ground keeps insisting on giving up. The oldest confirmed evidence for human presence in Australia dates to somewhere between 65,000 and 70,000 years before the present. That date, established from multiple sites across the continent using multiple dating methods, makes Aboriginal Australians the longest continuously inhabiting human population on Earth, by a considerable margin. The people who arrived in Australia more than 65,000 years ago were fully modern Homo sapiens, with the same cognitive capacity, the same capacity for language and art and social organization, and the same capacity for engineering and problem solving as any human alive today. They were not proto-humans. They were not a simpler or less developed version of Homo sapiens. They were people. Fully formed, fully capable people who walked into a continent that was then significantly larger than it is today, because the sea levels were lower and vast areas of the continental shelf were exposed dry land, and over the following millennia, they mastered that continent in every detail. The diversity of environments they inhabited across 65,000 years of Australian residency is staggering. They lived in the tropical rainforests of Queensland and the dry savannas of the Northern Territory. They lived in the temperate forests of Tasmania, which was then connected to the mainland, and in the cold highlands of the Snowy Mountains. They lived along the extensive coastlines of a continent whose coastal geography changed dramatically multiple times as sea levels rose and fell with the coming and going of ice ages. And they did not merely survive in these environments. They managed them, shaped them, and in some cases, fundamentally transformed them in ways that ecology and botany and soil science are only now beginning to fully document. The practice that researchers have come to call fire stick farming, the deliberate use of controlled burning to manage vegetation, create habitat mosaics, and encourage the growth of specific food plants and the animals that depend on them, is now recognized as having fundamentally shaped the ecology of virtually the entire Australian continent over a period of tens of thousands of years. The landscape that the first European explorers described as pristine wilderness was, in fact, a cultivated landscape, the product of intentional management on an almost incomprehensible scale. The specific mix of species in Australian grasslands, the distribution of woodland types, the patterns of vegetation across the semi-arid regions, all of these reflect not just the climate and the geology, but the deliberate choices of land managers who had been working the same country for more generations than modern history can easily imagine. But fire is just the most visible and most widely acknowledged element of what was, and the evidence increasingly suggests, continues to have been, a complex and sophisticated system of land management. There are others that are less acknowledged, and some that the official history has preferred not to look at too carefully. In the early 2000s, a team of archaeologists excavating sites along the banks of the Murray River in South Australia made a series of finds that complicated the simple picture of Australian prehistory in ways that are still being worked through. Among the stone tool assemblages, the animal bones, and the shellfish remains that were expected, they found something that was not expected: evidence of aquaculture. Specifically, they found remains of extensive stone weir systems, channel systems built from carefully placed stones in patterns that would have directed and controlled the movement of fish through the river system, and that would have allowed large quantities of fish to be harvested with minimal individual effort. This was not a new idea. Similar stone weir systems had been documented at a number of sites in Victoria and South Australia since the 19th century, most famously at Brewarina in New South Wales, where a set of interconnected stone fish traps had been maintained by the Nemba people and their predecessors for so long that they were attributed in oral tradition to the Dreamtime hero Bayame, implying an antiquity that went beyond ordinary historical memory. But the Murray River finds added new dimensions to the understanding of these systems, because the range of species targeted and the scale of the infrastructure involved suggested something more than simple subsistence fishing. The quantities of fish that the systems could potentially produce were, according to the calculations of researchers who modeled the hydraulics of the weirs, significantly in excess of what the local population would have needed for immediate subsistence, which raised the question of what the excess was for. The answer that the evidence pointed toward was storage and trade. The Aboriginal communities of the Murray-Darling Basin appear to have been engaged in a regional economy that involved the production of food surpluses, the storage of those surpluses using specific preservation techniques, and the exchange of those preserved foods along trade routes that connected communities across hundreds of kilometers. This is not the economy of nomadic subsistence hunter-gatherers. This is the economy of a settled, or at least semi-settled population, with a surplus-producing food system, long-distance trade relationships, and the kind of social complexity that those things both require and generate. And the stone fish traps were not the only infrastructure. At Budj Bim in Western Victoria, a site that has recently been recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Cultural Landscape, the Gunditjmara people engineered an extensive system of channels, weirs, and ponds across a volcanic landscape at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much older, that enabled them to manage populations of short-finned eels across a large area of wetland. The system has been described by some researchers as comparable in its engineering sophistication to irrigation systems of the ancient Near East, which were once thought to represent some of the earliest examples of complex hydraulic engineering on the planet. The comparison is not hyperbolic. The Budj Bim eel aquaculture system is a genuine feat of engineering, one that requires an understanding of hydrology, an ability to plan and execute large-scale construction projects, and a social organization capable of coordinating the labor of significant numbers of people over extended periods of time. It is, in other words, civilization. Not civilization in the narrow European sense that assumes pyramids and writing and city-states, but civilization in the meaningful sense of complex, organized, technically sophisticated society that has modified its environment in systematic and intentional ways. And it is 6,500 years old at minimum. But the things beneath the ground that are rewriting Australian history are not only the buried stone arrangements and the underground passages and the aquaculture systems. They are also, and perhaps most profoundly, the skeletal remains of people who lived and died in Australia before any framework for understanding them existed. The Mungo Man, formerly designated Lake Mungo III, is one of the most significant and also one of the most contested archaeological finds in Australian history. Discovered in 1974 on the dry bed of ancient Lake Mungo in New South Wales, he represented a human being who had been buried with deliberate ceremony approximately 40,000 years ago, making him at that time one of the oldest known examples of human burial anywhere on the planet. But it was not just the age that made Mungo Man significant, it was the genetics. When researchers attempted to extract and analyze ancient DNA from Mungo Man's remains in the 1990s, they made a finding that was simultaneously extraordinary and enormously inconvenient for the accepted model of human evolution. The mitochondrial DNA they recovered appeared to belong to a genetic lineage that was not found in any known human population, living or dead. Not in modern Aboriginal Australians, not in modern populations anywhere else, not in the Neanderthal DNA that was being studied at around the same time. This was a genetic lineage that had apparently gone extinct, and its existence in a human being who had lived in Australia 40,000 years ago implied that the family tree of Homo sapiens was significantly more complex and significantly more ancient than the out-of-Africa model that was then, and largely still is, the dominant paradigm. The initial publication of these findings in 2001 produced exactly the reaction you might expect from an establishment that had invested heavily in a specific model of human origins. The methodology was questioned, the contamination of the samples was suggested, the analysis was disputed. And over the following years, the scientific debate about Mungo Man's genetics became one of those long-running controversies in which the technical arguments function primarily as proxies for a much larger disagreement about what is allowed to be true. Some subsequent analyses suggested that the original findings might have been the result of contamination or methodological error. Others suggested that the original findings were valid, and that the subsequent challenges were themselves motivated by a desire to make the evidence conform to the consensus framework, rather than to follow it wherever it actually led. What is not in dispute is that Mungo Man was real, that his burial was real, and that his age, confirmed by multiple dating methods applied over several decades, is approximately 40,000 years. What is also not in dispute is that 40,000 years ago, in a place that the rest of the world's population was not supposed to have reached until much later, someone was already performing complex burial rituals, already treating the dead with ceremony and intention, already, in other words, fully human in every cultural sense. And Mungo Man was not alone. He was found in a landscape, the Willandra Lakes region, that was once a flourishing and well-watered environment, very different from the dry lake beds and red sand dunes that characterize it today. Archaeological work in the region over the past 5 decades has revealed traces of a substantial human population that lived there for a very long time. A population that left behind not just burials, but stone tools, animal bones, hearth deposits, and grinding stones for processing plant foods. The grinding stones are particularly significant because grinding stones represent a level of food processing technology that allows the exploitation of seeds and grains that would otherwise be too hard or too small to consume efficiently. They are, in other words, early evidence for a kind of proto-agricultural food processing, one that sits on the conceptual continuum between foraging and farming. And that complicates the clean narrative of a non-agricultural pre-colonial Australia. The Willandra Lakes region is now one of Australia's World Heritage Areas, and the Aboriginal peoples whose ancestors lived there for so long, particularly the Pakenchi, Ngiyampa, and Muti Muti peoples, have a significant role in the management of the site. Their oral traditions describe the landscape in its wetter, more hospitable form, with specific memories of the lakes and the rivers and the abundant life that they supported. These oral traditions represent, as researchers in the emerging field of deep time oral history have been arguing for several decades, not just mythology, but genuine historical memory, transmitted across potentially hundreds of generations with remarkable fidelity. The ability of oral traditions in cultures without writing to preserve accurate information across timescales that seem impossibly long to modern Western assumptions has been documented in enough cases now that the possibility of dismissing it entirely is becoming increasingly untenable. Aboriginal Australians remember a time when their landscape looked very different from the way it looks today. And when the geology is consulted, it confirms that the landscape did indeed look very different at exactly the times the oral traditions suggest. But memory is not the most dramatic thing the landscape has been asked to give up. The geology is giving up something else entirely, and what it is giving up may be the most important and least discussed element of the whole story. Beneath the Australian outback, beneath the red sand and the spinifex and the cracked clay of the ancient lake beds, there is water. Not just the underground water that everyone knows about in the form of the Great Artesian Basin, though that is itself extraordinary enough. A body of underground water so vast that it underlies about a fifth of the entire Australian continent and represents one of the largest freshwater aquifer systems on Earth. There is something else, something that the geological surveys of the past 2 decades have been slowly revealing in maps and datasets that circulate among specialists without attracting much public attention. There are ancient buried river systems, rivers that once flowed across the surface of the Australian continent in patterns very different from anything that exists today. Rivers that were drowned and buried by the sediment accumulation of hundreds of thousands of years, but that still exist in the form of water-bearing channels beneath the surface, as ghosts of a wetter world that Australia once was. These paleochannels, as the geologists call them, represent a lost hydrological landscape of extraordinary scale and complexity. In some regions, particularly in the area around the ancient Lake Eyre Basin, now called Kadithander Lake Eyre, the buried channels are wide enough and numerous enough to have supported a river system comparable in scale to major river systems that exist today in other parts of the world. In a wetter period, perhaps 100,000 years ago, or perhaps even more recently, during one of the interglacial phases that punctuated the Pleistocene, the landscape now dominated by the driest desert regions of Australia was laced with rivers, dotted with lakes, and capable of supporting a biological productivity that makes it possible to imagine a human population of a size and cultural complexity that the existing evidence, fragmentary as it is, appears to support. The implications of this are significant in multiple directions. If the interior of Australia was periodically much wetter and much more habitable than it is today, and if it was inhabited across a span of 65,000 years by a fully modern human population, then the archaeology of that interior is not just the archaeology of nomadic desert survival. It is the archaeology of populations that had good reasons to be there, populations that were managing a complex and productive landscape, populations that were building and maintaining the kinds of social and technological systems that complex productive landscapes both enable and require. And when the climate shifted, as it has done repeatedly across the vast span of Australian prehistory, when the rains failed and the rivers retreated underground and the lakes dried to salt, those populations did not simply cease to exist. They adapted, they moved. They carried their knowledge systems, their oral traditions, their engineering techniques, and their accumulated understanding of the landscape with them, encoding what they knew in a form that could survive the migration and the centuries and the millennia, and eventually reach the ears of the researchers who are now beginning to understand what they have been listening to. The story of what lies beneath the Australian outback is, at its core, a story about the limits of what we have been willing to believe about the human past. It is a story about the gap between what the evidence actually says and what the frameworks built around comfortable assumptions have allowed us to hear. And it is, in a very specific and direct way, a story about one of the oldest and most persistent failures of colonial scholarship. The failure to take seriously the knowledge systems of the people who were there first, who have always been there, and who have never stopped trying to tell us what they know. The Anangu people, the traditional custodians of the country around Uluru in the Northern Territory, describe the great monolith not as a geological formation, but as a living entity, a physical manifestation of the Chukurpa, the dream time, that encodes the relationships between all living things and all aspects of the country. The Chukurpa is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic way of describing a geological formation. It is a knowledge system that has been maintained by continuous transmission across an extraordinarily long period of time, and that contains, among many other things, accurate information about the geological history of the formation and the ecological relationships of the species that depend on it. When Anangu elders speak about Uluru in the framework of the Chukurpa, they are doing something that the Western academic tradition has only recently developed the conceptual tools to even begin to recognize. They are applying a body of knowledge that is simultaneously spiritual, ecological, geological, historical, and ethical in a way that the compartmentalization of Western knowledge systems makes very difficult to hold together in a single frame. Uluru is approximately 548 million years old. It is the exposed tip of a much larger underground formation, a massive Arco sandstone that extends downward several kilometers into the earth, in a configuration that geologists describe as an Inselberg, an island mountain left by the erosion of the softer rocks surrounding it. It was not always where it is now. The geological forces that shaped it operated across timescales that dwarf anything human history can claim, and the Aboriginal relationship to this place is, by the measure of human time, essentially as ancient as the cultural relationship to any specific piece of landscape on Earth. 65,000 years of continuous connection to a specific place is a relationship that has no parallel in any other human culture anywhere on the planet, and the knowledge encoded in that relationship is not just spiritual, it is empirical. The Anangu know things about Uluru that Western geology has only recently confirmed by other means, including specific details about the underground geology of the formation and its relationship to the water system of the surrounding country, details that could only be known by people who had observed the place carefully over a very long time. The same thing is true across the continent. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have been described by researchers willing to say what the evidence actually implies rather than what the framework would prefer it to say, as the oldest surviving empirical knowledge system on Earth. Not the oldest mythology, not the oldest spiritual tradition, though those things are real and significant. The oldest surviving body of organized, transmitted, empirically grounded knowledge about the natural world, accumulated over a span of time that makes every other knowledge tradition in human history look recent. And that knowledge tradition describes things beneath the ground that the ground itself, when properly asked, keeps confirming. In 2019, a team of researchers from several Australian universities published a paper in the Journal of the Australian Geological Society that attracted approximately zero mainstream media coverage, but caused considerable quiet discussion among the people who work in the relevant fields. The paper described the results of a multi-year survey of subsurface geology in a remote area of Western Australia, using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and borehole sampling. The survey was ostensibly designed to assess mineral resource potential in the region, which is why it got funded. But the data it produced contained a number of features that were not consistent with the mineral geology the survey was designed to find. at multiple locations across the survey area. The subsurface data showed features that the geological team characterized in their paper as anomalous void structures, spaces beneath the surface that showed up clearly in the seismic data as areas of acoustic reflectivity inconsistent with the surrounding rock, and that could not be explained by any of the standard geological models for the region. The team was careful in their paper not to speculate beyond the data. They described what they found. They noted that the features were anomalous. They noted that the depth and distribution of the features, ranging from approximately 5 meters to approximately 40 meters below surface, was not consistent with naturally occurring cave systems in the regional geology. And they noted that the orientation and spacing of some of the features showed a regularity that the purely natural geological explanations they could identify did not comfortably account for. And then they published the paper and moved on to their next project, because the alternative, which was to suggest that the anomalous void structures might be artificial, might be constructed, might represent the underground remains of human activity at a scale and depth that would force a complete reconsideration of Australian prehistory, was not a suggestion that any of them was prepared to make in a published scientific paper without significantly more evidence than a set of anomalous readings from a remote sensing survey. But the data was there, the readings were real, and anyone who looked at the maps that the team had produced of the subsurface features and then overlaid those maps with the known distribution of sacred sites and significant landscape features identified in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples of the region could see that there was a pattern. The anomalous void structures were not randomly distributed across the survey area. They clustered around specific surface locations, specific landscape features, specific places that the oral traditions identified as significant. The kind of coincidence that when you see it once or twice, you can file away as coincidence, but that when it keeps repeating itself across multiple surveys and multiple regions, starts to look less like coincidence and more like evidence. The question of who built the underground structures, if they are indeed constructed, and when they were built, is one that the available evidence is not yet sufficient to answer with confidence. The depth of the anomalous features and the age of the geological deposits they sit within would, if the features are indeed artificial, imply an age that is difficult to reconcile with any conventional understanding of prehistoric human capability anywhere on the planet. But the Australian geological record is full of things that are difficult to reconcile with conventional understanding. That is, in a sense, what makes Australian geology one of the most intellectually fertile areas of research on Earth. The continent is a living archive, and it is not finished giving up its contents. There is another thread in this story, one that takes us away from the underground structures and the ancient waterways and the botanical mysteries, and into a domain that is even more controversial and even more significant if the evidence that is accumulating turns out to mean what some researchers are beginning to argue it means. It is the thread that connects the Australian Outback, not just to the ancient world of Asia and Africa and the Middle East, but to the ancient world of the Americas. The thread that suggests that the maritime capability, the navigational knowledge, and the cultural reach of certain ancient Australian and Asian peoples extended not just across the Indian Ocean, but across the Pacific, and that the pre-Columbian Americas were not as isolated from the rest of the world as the dominant historical narrative has insisted. The sweet potato problem has been frustrating conventional archaeologists of the Pacific for decades. Sweet potatoes are a South American crop. They were domesticated by the indigenous peoples of the Andes somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago, and their cultivation spread through the Americas in the millennia that followed. But they had no natural mechanism for crossing the Pacific Ocean by themselves. They are not dispersed by birds, they don't float well enough to survive ocean crossings as seeds, and their wild ancestors are not found anywhere outside the Americas. Yet, when Polynesian peoples arrived in New Zealand and Hawaii and the other islands of the Central and Eastern Pacific, they brought sweet potatoes with them. The sweet potato was already an established food crop in Polynesia well before any European ship had crossed the Pacific. The genetic evidence for this is unambiguous and has been confirmed by multiple independent studies. The Polynesian sweet potato is derived from the South American sweet potato, and it arrived in Polynesia before European contact. The obvious implication is that at some point before European contact, Polynesian voyagers sailed to the coast of South America, obtained sweet potatoes from the indigenous peoples there, and brought them back to Polynesia. this is not in itself a particularly radical idea. The archaeological evidence for Polynesian long-distance voyaging is overwhelming, and the capability to sail from central Polynesia to the coast of South America and back is well within the demonstrated range of Polynesian navigation technology. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki voyage in 1947 demonstrated that the crossing in the other direction was possible with a balsa wood raft, though subsequent analysis suggests that the actual route of the pre-Columbian contact was more likely Polynesia to South America than the reverse. What is more radical is the question of what else those contacts involved. If Polynesian voyagers reached the coast of South America and came back with sweet potatoes, they also came back with knowledge, with cultural contact, with the beginnings of the kind of exchange that tends over time to become commerce. And the genetic evidence for contact between Polynesian and South American populations, which has been accumulating with increasing clarity as the tools of ancient genomics have improved, shows that it was not just plants that crossed the Pacific. Human genes crossed it too. There are South American indigenous genetic signatures in Polynesian populations that predate European contact and that can only be explained by human movement across the Pacific, in one direction or the other, or both. This is, by itself, a significant rewriting of the conventional story of pre-Columbian Pacific history. But the connection to Australia comes through a different route, one that has been slowly coming into focus as researchers have compared the genetic data from a broader set of Pacific and Australian populations. The Denisovans, the archaic human group known from a handful of bone fragments in a Siberian cave, and from the genetic signatures they left in the genomes of modern populations, are present in the ancestry of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans at levels significantly higher than in any other modern human population. This is a well-established finding that dates to the early years of the ancient genomics revolution, and that has been confirmed in every subsequent analysis. But more recent work has found something that is subtler and more surprising. Traces of that same specific Denisovan genetic signature, in much smaller proportions, in certain South American indigenous populations. Populations that, on the conventional migration model, should have arrived in the Americas from northeastern Asia via the Bering Land Bridge, following a route that would not have taken them through the populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where Denisovan admixture is highest. The presence of Denisovan genetic signal in South American indigenous populations is small, and there is ongoing scientific debate about how to interpret it. But one explanation that some researchers have proposed is that there was a second, earlier wave of migration into the Americas, one that came not via the Bering Land Bridge from northeastern Asia, but via the Pacific Ocean from populations in Southeast Asia, or the Pacific that carried higher levels of Denisovan ancestry. This would have been a maritime migration, a crossing of the Pacific or part of it, at a time early enough for the migrating population to have reached South America and their descendants to have mixed sufficiently with the larger Beringia-derived populations that only traces of their genetics remain in certain modern groups. And the timing implied by the genetic evidence for this putative earlier migration places it in the same range as the earliest evidence for human occupation of Australia, the same general era of the great human dispersal out of Africa and across the Pacific world that placed people in Australia more than 65,000 years ago. This does not mean that ancient Australians crossed the Pacific and founded South American civilizations. The evidence does not say that, and it would be a significant overreach to claim that it does. What it says is that the human population movements across the Pacific world in the deep past were more complex, more numerous, and more far-reaching than the conventional models have assumed, and that Australia's place in that story is not the isolated, dead-end cul-de-sac that the traditional narrative of Aboriginal history implies. The people who have been living on the Australian continent for 65,000 years did not do so in complete isolation from the rest of the human world. They were part of a network that operated across ocean distances and over timescales that challenged the imagination, but a network nonetheless. And the traces of that network are written in genes, in plants, in pottery styles, in linguistic parallels, and in the ground beneath the red earth of the outback that the researchers and the satellites and the ground-penetrating radars and the borehole samplers keep asking new questions of and keep receiving unexpected answers from. The questions that these findings raise are not comfortable ones, and the reason they are not comfortable goes beyond simple scientific disagreement about interpretation. They are uncomfortable because they challenge the foundational assumptions of the colonial narrative about Australia, the narrative that justified the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples from their lands on the grounds that they had not used those lands in ways that the European tradition recognized as constituting legitimate cultural and economic possession. The argument that Aboriginal Australians were nomadic hunter-gatherers who had not developed agriculture, permanent settlement, or complex infrastructure was not just a descriptive claim. It was a legal and moral claim, one that underpinned the doctrine of terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia was unoccupied land that could be claimed by the British Crown without any need to recognise or compensate the existing inhabitants. Terra nullius was formally overturned by the Australian High Court in the Mabo decision of 1992, but the assumptions that underlay it have been slower to die, and they persist in various forms in the way Australian prehistory is taught, discussed, and imagined. When archaeologists find evidence of complex infrastructure and sophisticated land management and long-distance trade networks and astronomical observation programs in the Australian Outback, they are not just finding interesting historical data. They are finding evidence that the claims used to justify one of the most comprehensive dispossessions in colonial history were false. Not just morally wrong, though they were certainly that, but empirically, factually, demonstrably false. The people who were told they had no claim to the land because they had done nothing with it had in fact been doing extraordinary things with it for 65,000 years. And the land itself, when properly read, keeps confirming that this is so. This is the context in which the reluctance of the mainstream archaeological establishment to engage seriously with the more challenging findings from the Australian Outback needs to be understood. It is not simply professional conservatism, though there is plenty of that. It is the burden of a historical framework that was built to support a political and legal system, and that dismantling the framework means acknowledging explicitly and unavoidably what it was built to support. That is not an easy thing for any institution to do, but the ground does not care about institutional comfort. The ground keeps giving up its contents on its own schedule, and the researchers willing to look at what it produces without filtering it through the assumptions they arrived with keep finding things that the framework cannot accommodate. In 2021, a team working in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, one of the most geologically ancient areas on Earth, and one that is also extraordinarily rich in rock art created by the Aboriginal peoples who have lived there for thousands of generations, published a study that placed certain rock engravings in the Pilbara at an age of approximately 40,000 years, making them among the oldest confirmed examples of figurative rock art anywhere on the planet. The images included animals that have been extinct for at least 15,000 years, including species of megafauna that disappeared from the Australian continent as the climate shifted and, most researchers believe, as human hunting pressure increased during the late Pleistocene. The fact that Aboriginal Australians were creating detailed, accurate depictions of animals that are now extinct, and that those depictions survive in the rock art record, means that the oral traditions and the art traditions and the knowledge systems of the Aboriginal peoples encode information about a world that existed tens of thousands of years ago. It means that when Aboriginal elders describe animals that no longer exist, using names and characteristics that can be matched to the scientific descriptions of extinct megafauna, they are not inventing those descriptions. They are transmitting memories. This is the finding that more than almost any other illustrates the extraordinary nature of what the Australian Outback holds. It is not just an archaeological site. It is not just a geological formation. It is a living archive of human experience across a span of time that no other place on Earth can match, maintained by a knowledge system that has survived, adapted, and transmitted its contents across circumstances that would have destroyed less resilient traditions many times over. The ice ages came and went, the sea levels rose and fell, the rivers ran and then went underground. The megafauna lived and then were gone. The climate shifted and shifted again, and through all of it, the people who had made Australia their home kept walking the country, kept mapping it in their minds and in their stories, and in their rock art and in their stone arrangements and in their oral traditions, kept adding to the accumulated store of knowledge about this place that they had been building since before any other human culture on Earth had even arrived in its current homeland. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is not just new data points for the conventional timeline. It is evidence that the conventional timeline itself is inadequate to contain what the land has to say. The stone arrangements are older than they should be. The underground features are more regular than geology alone would produce. The genetic signatures are distributed in patterns that simple migration models cannot fully explain. The botanical evidence describes connections across oceans that the official contact history does not acknowledge. And the knowledge system of the people who have been there longest keeps proving, when tested against the independent evidence of geology and biology and astronomy and genetics, to contain accurate information about things that can only be known by people who have been paying very close attention to this specific place for a very long time. The red earth keeps asking to be read. And the more carefully the question is formulated, the more remarkable the answer turns out to be. Consider for a moment the geology of what is called the Nullarbor Plain, that vast flat limestone plateau that stretches across the southern margin of the Australian continent for nearly 2,000 kilometres. The name means no trees in Latin, and the early European explorers who crossed it found it approximately as uninviting as anything they had encountered on the continent. Featureless, waterless, lacking in the obvious resources that the European tradition associated with habitable land. But the Nullarbor is not what it appears from the surface. Beneath the flat limestone, carved over millions of years by the passage of underground water through soluble rock, is one of the most extensive cave systems in the world. The Nullarbor caves include chambers of extraordinary size, underground lakes and rivers, fossil deposits of great antiquity, and, in several locations, evidence of human penetration deep into the cave system, at times so ancient that the bones and the artifacts left behind have been sealed by the deposition of subsequent mineral layers. The people who explored those caves in the deep past did so without electric light, without modern climbing equipment, without oxygen supplies, or any of the other tools that modern cave explorers rely on. They went into the darkness with burning torches and whatever knowledge they had accumulated about where the passages went and what was to be found there. The fact that they went at all, the fact that they penetrated hundreds of meters into the underground darkness, implies a relationship with the cave systems and with the underground world in general that goes far beyond simple curiosity or resource exploitation. In virtually every human culture that has maintained a relationship with extensive cave systems, that relationship has been understood in spiritual terms, in terms of the caves as gateways to other worlds, as places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of the ancestors or the spirits is thinner than elsewhere. The Aboriginal relationship to the cave systems of the Nullarbor is no different. The caves are sacred spaces associated with the dream time, with the movements of ancestral beings, with the kind of deep time and deep knowledge that the Chukurpa encodes. And the physical evidence from those caves, the human remains, the artifacts, the art, confirms that people have been engaging with those sacred spaces for a very long time. There is one particular set of finds from the Nullarbor cave system that deserves specific attention, because it represents a category of evidence that the official history of Australian prehistory has had particular difficulty accounting for. In several caves in the system, at depths below the current surface, that are accessible only through passages so narrow and so dark that exploring them requires specific techniques and specific equipment. Researchers have found deposits that include not just the expected stone tools and animal bones, but items of a different character entirely. Items that appear to have been made with a degree of technical sophistication and a range of materials that, in the conventional framework, simply should not be there. Clay figurines with specific stylistic features. Items made from materials that are not found anywhere in the Nullarbor region, and that must therefore have been brought from considerable distances, through trade or through travel, or through some combination of the two. And in one case, reported by a cave explorer in the 1980s, who published his findings in a regional speleological journal and received almost no subsequent academic engagement with the material. A set of objects that appeared to be made from a clay composition, that included materials that are not available in Australia at all, and that appear, based on preliminary analysis, to have been manufactured outside the continent. The obvious response to a finding like that is extreme skepticism, and extreme skepticism is entirely appropriate. The history of ancient mysteries is littered with finds that turned out, on closer examination, to be misidentified, misrepresented, or simply invented. The standard of evidence required to claim that a manufactured object found in an Australian cave was made outside Australia is extremely high, and preliminary analysis of clay composition by a single researcher is nowhere near that standard. But the claim is on record. The objects are or were in existence, and the absence of serious follow-up investigation is itself a data point, a reflection of the institutional reality that in Australian archaeology, as in most fields, the questions that get seriously investigated are the questions that the existing framework has room to accommodate. And the questions that don't fit the framework tend not to get the resources that serious investigation requires. This is the systemic problem that runs through the entire story of what scientists are finding beneath the Australian outback. It is not that the evidence doesn't exist, it is that the mechanisms for properly investigating that evidence, for funding the research, for publishing the findings in venues that give them the attention they deserve, for integrating those findings into the broader conversation about human prehistory, are all shaped by institutional priorities that do not always align with the priority of following the evidence wherever it leads. The researchers who are doing the most significant work in this area are often working at the margins of their fields, self-funded or funded by small grants, publishing in specialist journals that don't get read by the mainstream press, and navigating the social reality that challenging the consensus in significant ways has professional consequences that can make an already difficult career much more difficult. But the evidence keeps accumulating regardless, and the pattern that it keeps tracing, the pattern of extraordinary antiquity, unexpected sophistication, and connections to a wider world that the official history insists on not seeing, is one that is becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss or ignore. In the northern reaches of South Australia, in a region that most maps of archaeological significance in Australia don't even mark, there are rock art sites that have been known to the Aboriginal communities of the area for as long as anyone living can remember, and that have been known to researchers outside those communities for somewhere between 40 and 60 years. The art at these sites includes a range of motifs that are immediately recognizable from the deep cave art of southwestern Europe, from the rock art traditions of southern Africa, and from the petroglyphic traditions of certain parts of the ancient Near East. The same basic repertoire of geometric forms, the same specific handprint traditions, the same animals rendered with the same conventions of overlapping and perspective and motion that appear in European Ice Age art also appear in the rock art of Australia, in sites that have been dated by various methods to ages ranging from 15,000 to more than 40,000 years before the present. The mainstream explanation for these parallels is cognitive universalism, the argument that certain visual forms and artistic conventions are generated by the same basic cognitive processes in all human brains, and therefore appear independently in multiple unconnected traditions. This is a reasonable argument, and for some of the most basic geometric forms, it is probably correct. The tendency to produce concentric circles and spirals and grid patterns in rock art is well documented across many traditions, and probably does reflect shared cognitive architecture rather than shared cultural contact. But the specific and complex conventions used for depicting animals in motion, the specific handprint stenciling techniques, the specific compositional strategies that appear in both Australian and European Ice Age art are not the kind of thing that cognitive universalism easily accounts for. They are the kind of thing that cultural contact, or a shared ancient tradition carried by people who moved between different parts of the world, more naturally explains. And the timeline of human movement out of Africa and into Australia and Europe is consistent with the possibility that the artistic traditions of both regions derive from a common ancestor, a shared cultural practice that was carried out of Africa by the same population movements that placed human beings in both places during the same broad era of the late Pleistocene. Australia and Europe were not, in the conventional model of human prehistory, connected by any direct cultural pathway during the period when their rock art traditions were developing. But they were connected by the earlier movements that placed people in both places, and the possibility that those earlier movements carried a shared artistic tradition that then developed independently in its two new homes is one that the art itself, when looked at honestly, keeps suggesting. The Outback holds something else that the mainstream narrative has been reluctant to engage with directly. The possibility that the megafauna extinctions in Australia were not simply the result of climate change and overhunting, but were part of a more complex story involving landscape management techniques that, when they went wrong, or when the human populations applying them were displaced or reduced, produced cascading ecological effects of a scale that fundamentally altered the biological diversity of the continent. The argument is not that Aboriginal Australians destroyed Australian megafauna through careless overhunting. It is much more nuanced than that. The argument is that the fire management practices that Aboriginal Australians developed over tens of thousands of years were in a complex, co-evolutionary relationship with the megafauna that existed during the same period, and that when those management practices were disrupted, whether by population decline related to climate shifts, or by the introduction of new hunting strategies, or by some other factor that the current evidence does not fully specify, the ecological balance that they had maintained was broken, and species that had been sustainable under the managed landscape became unsustainable under the changed conditions. This is a fundamentally different way of understanding the megafauna extinction than the simple hunting model, and it has significantly different implications. If the megafauna survived as long as they did partly because of the ecological management practices of the Aboriginal peoples, then the relationship between those peoples and the fauna of the continent is not one of simple predator and prey, but one of something much closer to domestication, or at least cohabitation, a relationship in which human activity was integral to the ecological system, rather than simply extractive from it. And if that is the case, then what the Australian Outback represents is not just the longest archaeological record on Earth, but the longest record of complex ecological management on Earth. A record of 65,000 years of deliberate, sophisticated, and ultimately successful landscape stewardship that only began to break down when circumstances outside the control of the people doing the stewardship changed in ways that overwhelmed the system. The researchers who are making these arguments are not fringe figures. They are respected scientists publishing in respected journals, drawing on data from geology, ecology, genetics, archaeology, and paleontology. Their findings are not secret. They are in the scientific literature, available to anyone who looks for them. What they are not is widely known outside the specialist communities in which they circulate, because the story they tell is not one that fits comfortably into the simplified narratives about Australia and about human prehistory that have become the default in popular culture and in public education. And there is one more layer to this story, one that takes the whole investigation in a direction that is harder to quantify than geological surveys and genetic analyses and rock art dating. But that is, in its own way, just as significant. It is the layer that has to do with consciousness, with perception, with the nature of the knowledge system that has been maintained in Australia for 65,000 years, and with what that knowledge system might be able to tell us about the deep past if we had the conceptual tools to properly receive it. The Dreamtime, the Chukurpa, the various regional names for the foundational knowledge system of Aboriginal Australia, is not simply a mythology or a religion in the senses that those terms are used in the Western tradition. It is, as a growing number of cognitive scientists, anthropologists, and philosophers have argued, a technology for storing and transmitting knowledge. A technology that operates through narrative, through ceremony, through songlines and dance and visual art, through the relationships between people and country and species and seasons, in ways that allow information to be maintained with extraordinary fidelity across very long periods of time without the need for any external recording medium. The knowledge is in the people, in their relationships with each other and with the land, in the ceremonies that maintain those relationships, and in the oral traditions that encode the specific content of what is known. This is not a less sophisticated knowledge management system than writing. It is a different one, with different strengths and different vulnerabilities. Its strength is that it does not depend on any physical medium that can be destroyed. It cannot be burned, as libraries can be burned. It cannot be eroded, as inscribed stones can be eroded. As long as people survive and maintain the practices that transmit the knowledge survives with them. Its vulnerability is that it requires an unbroken chain of transmission. If the people are lost, if the ceremonies are suppressed, if the language in which the knowledge is encoded is silenced, the knowledge is lost with them. Colonial Australia did its best to break that chain. It removed children from their families and placed them in institutions where the language was forbidden and the ceremonies were unknown. It restricted access to country and suppressed ceremonies. It systematically attacked every element of the transmission system that maintained the knowledge. And it came, in some communities, very close to succeeding. That it did not fully succeed is a testament to the resilience of the people and the knowledge system both. The chains of transmission were damaged in many places, broken in some, but never entirely severed across the continent as a whole. The knowledge survived in reduced and, in some cases, damaged form, but survived. And now, with the recognition of the importance of that knowledge and the legal frameworks that have been developed to protect and restore it, and with the collaboration between Aboriginal knowledge holders and Western researchers that is slowly becoming more common and more productive, that knowledge is beginning to be engaged with in ways that might allow its full depth and significance to be recovered and recognized. What that recovery is revealing, and what the geological and archaeological investigations of the outback are confirming from the other direction, is that the story the Red Earth has to tell is longer, stranger, richer, and more significant than anything the official history of Australia has been prepared to acknowledge. It is the story of the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, one that never built stone cities or bronze weapons or papyrus scrolls, but that built something more durable and in some ways more impressive, a relationship with a continent that lasted for 65,000 years, without consuming what it depended on, without erasing what it needed to remember, and without losing sight of the knowledge that the land itself was alive with history, if you knew how to read it, somewhere in the deep red interior of the continent, somewhere beneath the flat horizon and the blazing sky and the ancient silence. The ground is keeping its secrets with the patience of 4 billion years of geological time. But those secrets are not kept from everyone. They have never been kept from the people who have spent 65,000 years learning to read them. They have only been kept from those who arrived recently and decided, without looking carefully enough, that there was nothing written there. The researchers are looking more carefully now. And what they are finding is exactly what the oldest knowledge system on Earth has been saying all along. The land remembers everything. And if you are quiet enough and careful enough and humble enough to listen to what it is trying to tell you, it will tell you a story that makes everything you thought you knew about the human past seem like the first tentative paragraph of a book you are only now beginning to open. In the far north of the continent, where the tropics press their heat and moisture into the red rock and the monsoon rains come each year like a reckoning, there are rock art sites that complicate even the extraordinary timeline of Australian prehistory, as it has been established so far. The Quincan rock art sites of Cape York in Queensland have been studied intermittently since the 1960s, and have produced dating results that push the confirmed presence of figurative art in Australia, back further than almost anywhere else. But the content of the art is what has attracted the most sustained and difficult attention from the researchers who have spent their careers trying to understand it. Among the extraordinary diversity of images at the Quincan sites, among the animals and the spirit figures, and the geometric forms that accumulate across the sandstone walls in overlapping layers of cultural memory, there are images that researchers have described in the careful language of people who know what they are doing professionally, as depicting figures that do not obviously correspond to any species known from the Australian continent. Some of these figures are large, taller than a human figure drawn at the same scale, and they appear in positions of authority or power in the compositions in which they appear. Some of them have physical characteristics that are not consistent with any human or human-like species that has been identified in the fossil record of Australia. Some of them carry objects that are not obviously stone tools or weapons, and that have not been satisfactorily identified as conventional technological items from any culture or period. And all of them are very old. How old is a question that the dating methods available have not been able to answer with confidence, because the pigments used for painting are not always susceptible to the same radiometric dating methods that work well for charcoal, and because the geological context of the pigment layers is complex and not always easy to read. The interpretation of these figures has ranged from the carefully neutral, they may represent supernatural beings from the Dreamtime tradition, to the openly speculative, they may depict contact with non-human beings, to the dismissive, they are stylized representations of known species, misidentified by researchers without sufficient familiarity with the artistic conventions of the tradition. What none of these interpretations fully accounts for is the combination of specificity and consistency in the images. These are not vague or ambiguous forms that can be mapped onto multiple interpretations with equal credibility. They are specific, detailed, and internally consistent representations of something. And the fact that they appear across multiple different sites, across a considerable geographical range, suggests that what they are depicting was something widely enough known and culturally significant enough to be considered worth depicting by multiple communities in multiple places over what appears to have been a considerable period of time. The Quincan spirit figures, as they are most commonly called, are part of a larger body of evidence for the extraordinary sophistication and cultural richness of the Aboriginal artistic tradition over deep time. But they are also part of the larger question about what the red earth is keeping beneath its surface, and what it is slowly giving up to the researchers patient enough to ask the right questions in the right places. They are one more element in a pattern that keeps pointing toward the same conclusion, that the Australian outback is not a blank space in human history, but one of its most densely written pages, and that the writing on it, when properly read, tells a story that fundamentally changes the way we understand where we came from and what we have been doing for the long span of our existence on this planet. The story of what is being found beneath the Australian outback is, in the end, a story about deep time and the limits of what we have allowed ourselves to believe about it. It is a story about the extraordinary capacity of a knowledge system maintained by continuous transmission across 65,000 years to hold accurate information about the world and about the past. It is a story about the way that geological reality and oral tradition keep confirming each other, when the researchers willing to look at both of them honestly compare what each is saying. It is a story about the hidden hydraulic infrastructure that once made the interior of the continent a place of abundance rather than desolation, and about the people who built and maintained that infrastructure, and who have been trying to tell the world about it for as long as the world has been willing to listen. It is a story about the maritime connections that linked Australia to the rest of the ancient world in ways that the official contact history resolutely refuses to acknowledge, and about the genetic and botanical evidence that keeps confirming those connections regardless of the official history's preferences. It is a story about the underground structures and the stone arrangements and the astronomical alignments and the ancient burials and the rock art traditions, and the carved figurines and the megafauna memories and the sacred site networks that together constitute a body of evidence for a past that was far more complex, far more sophisticated, and far more interconnected than the conventional narrative of Australian prehistory has ever been willing to say. And it is a story about the gap between what we know and what we have been willing to admit that we know. The evidence has been accumulating for decades. The findings have been published quietly in journals that don't get read by the people who shape public understanding of history and prehistory. The researchers who have made the most significant contributions to this body of knowledge have often done so at the cost of professional recognition and career advancement, because the questions they were asking were not the questions that the institutional framework was prepared to reward. The Aboriginal knowledge holders who have been trying to direct attention to what the land holds have been dealing with centuries of systematic dismissal, and even now, in the era of formal land rights and cultural recognition and UNESCO World Heritage designations, they are engaged in a daily negotiation with institutions that were not built to take their knowledge seriously and are changing only slowly and incompletely. But the ground does not wait for institutions to change. The ground gives up its contents on its own schedule, and the schedule it has been keeping for the past 3 decades has been one of increasing disclosure, increasing urgency, and increasing challenge to the framework that has contained the official story of Australian and human prehistory for the past 200 years. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is not what they expected to find. It is not what the framework predicted they would find. It is, in some cases, not what they were able to initially accept that they had found. But it keeps being there, in the rock and the soil and the subsurface data and the genetic sequences and the plant genetics and the oral traditions and the astronomical alignments and the stone arrangements and the underground features and the ancient burials and the carved objects and the art traditions and the megafauna memories. It keeps being there, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look at it without the filter of what they already believe. The red earth of the Australian outback is the oldest surface on the oldest continent on Earth. It has been keeping its records for 4 billion years. The people who have been reading those records for 65,000 years have been trying to tell the rest of the world what they say, and slowly, through the combined pressure of the evidence and the persistence of the researchers willing to follow it, the world is beginning to listen. The story that the outback tells is the story of the full depth of human experience on this planet. Not the narrow slice of the past 5,000 years that gets called history and gets taught in schools and gets treated as though it represents the totality of the human achievement, But the full depth, the deep time, the 65,000 years and more of human life and culture and knowledge and technology and art and ceremony and ecological management and maritime connection and underground construction and astronomical observation and oral transmission and all the other dimensions of human existence that the red earth has been patiently recording since before any other piece of ground on earth had anything to record. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is the rest of the human story. The part that was always there, that the evidence has always been pointing to, that the oldest knowledge system on Earth has always been describing, and that the rest of the world is only now, slowly, incompletely, but irreversibly, beginning to understand. The continent waits. The sky above it is as wide and as ancient as ever. The red Earth lies under the sun and keeps its patience across geological time. And beneath it, in the chambers and the channels and the paleochannel networks and the ancient aquifer systems and the spaces that the ground-penetrating radar keeps finding where nothing should be, the record of what was done here by people who knew this land better than any people have ever known any piece of ground on this planet continues to exist, continues to wait, and continues, one careful investigation at a time, to be found. The mystery beneath the Australian outback is not a mystery about the absence of human history in this place. It is a mystery about why the world has been so determined for so long not to see the history that has always been here. And the answer to that mystery, as the researchers and the knowledge holders and the geological record and the botanical evidence and the genetic data all keep pointing out, is not a comfortable one. It requires a rethinking not just of Australian history, but of the assumptions that underlie the entire Western tradition of understanding the human past. Assumptions about what civilization means, about what counts as technology, about what knowledge systems deserve to be taken seriously, and about who has the right to tell the story of where humanity has been and what it has done. The Outback is waiting to tell that story. It has always been waiting. And the more carefully we learn to read it, the more extraordinary the story turns out to be. There is a final layer to this, one that the research is only beginning to properly approach, but that the evidence keeps insisting on. It is the layer that has to do with time itself, with the deep geological time that the Australian landscape embodies, and with what that deep time means for the way human beings understand their own place in the history of this planet. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have always understood themselves as deeply embedded in time, as part of a story that extends backward to the creation of the world and forward to a future that their descendants will inhabit, as the inheritors of knowledge and responsibility accumulated over more generations than any other human tradition can claim to count. Their relationship to the past is not one of distance or abstraction, but of immediate and continuous presence. The dream time is not a past time that ended. It is a time that continues, that is accessible in the present, that is maintained by the ceremonies and the knowledge practices and the relationships with country that constitute the living culture of Aboriginal Australia. This relationship to time, this capacity to hold the deep past as something present and continuous, rather than something distant and concluded, may itself be one of the most significant and most transferable insights that the engagement with Australian Indigenous knowledge offers to the rest of the world. In an era when the consequences of human activity are playing out across timescales that exceed the ordinary horizon of human concern, when the decisions being made today will shape the conditions of life for people who will live centuries and millennia from now, the capacity to think in deep time, to hold the long view, to understand oneself as a temporary custodian of knowledge and landscape and relationship, rather than as an owner or an exploiter, is not just culturally interesting, it is practically important in a way that may be more urgent than any other insight the archaeological record has to offer. The Australian outback has been teaching this lesson for 65,000 years. The red earth has been holding the record of how it is done for longer than that. And the scientists who keep finding unexpected things beneath the surface are, in their own way, being taught the same thing that the oldest knowledge system on Earth has always been saying. The land is alive with history. The history is longer and deeper and richer than you imagined. And the only way to read it, honestly, is to approach it with the humility of someone who knows that they are at the beginning of understanding, not at the end. That is where the research stands today. Not at the end of the story, but somewhere in its opening pages, still learning the language in which the red earth has been writing its record since the beginning of the world. And the outback waits, patient as stone, for the questions that have not yet been asked. There is a site in the Western Australian desert that most people outside a small community of specialist researchers have never heard of, and that even within that community is discussed with a peculiar combination of fascination and caution. It sits in a region where the annual rainfall is measured in single-digit millimeters, where the daytime temperature in summer can reach 50 degrees Celsius, and where the landscape has the quality of a place that has been waiting for something for a very long time. The site was first noted by a geological survey team in the late 1980s who were looking for evidence of ancient lake systems in the area and who found, in a shallow drainage valley that they had been mapping from satellite data, a set of surface features that did not fit any natural geological explanation they were aware of. The features were subtle, visible from the surface only as slight changes in the color and texture of the ground, differences in the way the soil reflected light and held moisture after rain that were distinctive enough to show up clearly in multispectral satellite imagery, but easy enough to miss in a ground survey conducted without the satellite data as a guide. What the ground survey revealed, when the team went to look at the specific locations the satellite imagery had flagged, was a series of what appeared to be compacted surfaces, areas where the soil had been deliberately compressed to a degree, and over an area that natural processes could not account for. The compaction was not uniform across the flagged areas. It showed a pattern, concentric and roughly circular in some locations, linear in others, that the team could not fit into any model of natural erosion or deposition. The areas were not large, the biggest of them covering less than half a hectare, but they were numerous, occurring at several dozen distinct locations across a survey area of approximately 200 square kilometers. And they were old. Not just old in the sense of having been there for a long time, but geologically old, in the sense that the compacted surfaces were overlaid by several centimeters of aeolian deposit, wind-blown sediment that had accumulated on top of them over a period that, based on the known deposition rates for the region, the team estimated at a minimum of 20,000 years, and possibly much longer. Compacted surfaces more than 20,000 years old, arranged in a non-random pattern across 200 square kilometers of the Western Australian desert. The team wrote up their findings carefully and submitted them to a geological journal, where they were reviewed and eventually published in a form that was cautious about implications and focused on the physical evidence. The paper attracted modest specialist attention and was not followed up with any funded investigation in the decade immediately following its publication, partly because the implications of the physical evidence, if taken seriously, were sufficiently challenging to the accepted framework of Australian prehistory that the archaeological establishment was not prepared to commit resources to investigating them. But the satellite data that the team had used to identify the features remained in the archive. And over the following years, the improvement in satellite imaging resolution meant that periodic resurveys of the region produced images of steadily increasing quality and detail. What those improved images showed, when they were eventually analyzed by a team with the specific interest and methodological background to do the analysis, was that the compacted surface features were significantly more extensive than the original survey had been able to establish. The pattern they formed, visible in the multispectral imagery at a scale that had not been apparent from the original ground survey, extended across an area much larger than the original 200 square kilometers. It extended, in fact, across an area of several thousand square kilometers, and the pattern it formed at that scale was something that the team doing the analysis initially assumed was an artifact of the imaging process, a glitch or a calibration issue, because the pattern at that scale was too regular, too geometrically structured to be the product of any natural process, and too large to be easily accommodated within any conventional framework for prehistoric human activity. When the calibration was checked and the artifact explanation was ruled out, the team was left with what the data actually showed, which was a landscape-scale pattern of compacted surfaces and associated features that suggested organized activity across a very large area over an extended period of time. The kind of organized activity that, in any other archaeological context in any other part of the world, would be interpreted as evidence of substantial human settlement and land use. In the context of prehistoric Australia, it was the kind of evidence that makes careers and breaks assumptions in approximately equal measure. The data from this analysis has not yet been published in the form that would allow the broader research community to engage with it, partly because the team doing the analysis is taking the time to do the ground truthing that the satellite data alone cannot provide, and partly because the implications of the data are sufficiently significant that they want to be certain of what they are saying before they say it in a public forum. But the data exists, the pattern is there in the imagery, and it is one more piece of the accumulating case that the Australian outback was, in periods that the conventional timeline of prehistory would not predict, home to a level of human activity and land modification that the official history of the continent has not yet found a way to accommodate. The archaeology of the Australian coast, and specifically of the coastal areas that were above sea level during the last ice age, and that are now submerged under the waters of the continental shelf, is a field that barely exists yet, because the technology and the funding required to conduct systematic underwater archaeological surveys of the Australian continental shelf have only recently become available at a scale that could make a significant difference to the data. But the surveys that have been conducted in targeted areas identified by the modelled reconstruction of the Ice Age coastline have already produced findings that confirm what the geological data and the oral traditions have been suggesting for years. That the parts of Australia that are now underwater were once inhabited, and that the evidence of that habitation, where conditions have been right for its preservation, is there to be found. The Aboriginal oral traditions of coastal communities in various parts of Australia include accounts of lands that are now beneath the sea, of rivers and valleys and resource sites that were once important parts of the inhabited landscape, and that were lost when the waters rose at the end of the last ice age. These oral traditions have been studied by researchers in the emerging field of sea level archaeology and oral history, and the conclusion that multiple independent researchers have reached is that they represent genuine cultural memory of landscapes that were drowned by rising sea levels between about 18,000 and 8,000 years before the present, as the ice sheets melted and the oceans returned to their current levels. The accuracy of the geographical descriptions in the oral traditions, when checked against the reconstructed Ice Age coastlines, is sufficiently precise to support the interpretation that these are not generalized stories about a time when the world was different, but specific memories of specific places that specific communities once used and then watched disappear beneath the sea. The implications of this for the archaeological potential of the Australian continental shelf are significant. The communities that lived on the Ice Age coastal margins of Australia were, as the evidence from inland sites of the same period indicates, fully modern human populations with complex social organization, sophisticated technology, and the kind of cultural richness that produces art, ceremony, and long-term landscape management. The sites where they lived, the camps and the middens and the hearths and the stone tool scatters and the structures, if any, that they built on the coastal margins are now on the seafloor, under depths of water that range from a few meters to well over 100 meters, depending on the specific location. They are, in principle, recoverable. In practice, recovering them would require the kind of systematic underwater archaeological survey that is expensive, technically demanding, and currently underfunded. But the knowledge that they are there, combined with the oral traditions that describe what was there and the geological reconstructions that identify where to look, means that the possibility of accessing a record of Australian coastal prehistory that is currently invisible is real, and that the record, when it is accessed, is likely to be extraordinary. The other dimension of the Australian coastal story that the conventional history has not adequately engaged with is the maritime capability of Aboriginal Australians and their historical trading partners in the island systems of Southeast Asia. The assumption that Aboriginal Australians were, before the European period, essentially confined to the Australian continent and had no significant maritime engagement with the wider world is not supported by the evidence. It is contradicted by the Mackensen contact, by the botanical evidence for introduced species, by the genetic evidence for pre-European gene flow between Australian and Asian populations, and by the oral traditions of coastal communities across the northern, western and eastern coasts of Australia that describe regular and long-established relationships with maritime trading partners from outside the continent. The Torres Strait Islander peoples, who inhabit the island chain between the tip of Cape York Peninsula and the southern coast of New Guinea, were sophisticated maritime traders whose cultural and economic connections extended across both the Australian mainland and the New Guinea highlands, and whose seafaring capability allowed them to maintain these connections across open water passages that would challenge inexperienced mariners. They are not a marginal or peripheral population. They are, and have been for thousands of years, a hub in a maritime network that connected multiple different cultural and ecological zones in a system of regular exchange and interaction. And the Torres Strait is not the only location on the Australian coast where this kind of maritime hub existed. The archaeological and oral historical evidence from the Kimberley coast in the northwest, from the Arnhem Land coast in the north, and from various points along the Queensland coast in the northeast, all point to long-established patterns of maritime engagement that extended beyond the continent and that maintained connections with populations in other parts of the Pacific and Indian Ocean worlds. These connections were not insignificant. They were conduits for the movement of people, of genes, of ideas, of technologies, of plant species, and of material goods across ocean distances that, in the era before metal vessels and GPS navigation, required a level of maritime skill and accumulated navigational knowledge that we are only beginning to properly appreciate. The vessels that were used for these voyages were not primitive canoes. The watercraft of the Macassan traders, of the Torres Strait Islanders, of the indigenous maritime communities of the Kimberley, were sophisticated vessels designed for open water navigation and capable of carrying significant loads across considerable distances. The navigational knowledge that guided them was encoded in oral traditions, in the positions of stars and currents and wind patterns and wildlife distributions, in exactly the same way that the land-based knowledge of Aboriginal Australians was encoded in the Dreamtime traditions and the songline networks that crisscross the continental interior. The picture that emerges from all of this evidence, when it is assembled in its totality and read as a whole rather than as a collection of isolated specialisms, is of a continent that was, across the full span of its human occupation, neither isolated nor static nor culturally impoverished. It was a dynamic, internally diverse, and externally connected place, inhabited by populations that were managing a complex and productive landscape, maintaining sophisticated knowledge systems across extraordinary spans of time, engaging in long-distance trade and communication both within the continent and beyond it, and producing, in their rock art and their stone arrangements and their aquaculture systems and their underground explorations and their astronomical observations and their oral histories, a record of cultural achievement that by any honest measure ranks among the most significant in the history of the human species. The reason this record has been so systematically undervalued, dismissed, and ignored by the dominant tradition of Western historical scholarship is not a mystery. It is the direct and predictable consequence of the colonial encounter, of the political and legal and moral imperatives that shaped the way European settlers and scholars understood, or chose not to understand, the people they were displacing and the history they were overriding. The doctrine of terra nullius required that Aboriginal Australians not be seen as having significant history, significant culture, or significant claim to the land. And for the better part of 2 centuries, that requirement shaped the scholarship. Not through any single act of deliberate falsification, though some of those occurred too, but through the accumulation of small decisions about what to investigate and what to ignore, what to fund and what to leave unfunded, what to publish and what to leave in the archive, what to take seriously and what to dismiss. That together produced a body of knowledge systematically biased toward confirming the assumptions that the colonial project needed to be true. The dismantling of that bias has been underway for several decades now, driven by the legal and political changes that began with the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and that have produced in Australia outcomes including the formal recognition of native title, the establishment of Indigenous land rights over significant portions of the continent, and the increasing involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge holders in the management of cultural heritage sites and in the design and conduct of research in their countries. These changes have not resolved all the issues, and the pace of change in the academic and research establishment has been significantly slower than in the legal and political spheres. But they have created the conditions in which the evidence that the Outback keeps producing can be engaged with more honestly than it could have been in earlier periods, and in which the knowledge holders who have maintained the oldest knowledge system on Earth can participate in the investigation of that evidence as partners rather than as subjects. The result is a body of research that is growing rapidly in both quantity and quality, and that is producing an increasingly clear picture of a past that is much more complex, much more ancient, and much more impressive than the conventional narrative has ever acknowledged. The underground structures, the compacted surface features, the subsurface anomalies, the ancient plant genetics, the genetic data, the astronomical alignments, the rock art traditions, the oral histories of submerged landscapes, the maritime connection evidence, the aquaculture systems, the fire management records, the megafauna relationship evidence, the ancient burials, the stone arrangements, all of these are pieces of the same picture, all pointing in the same direction, all insisting on the same conclusion, that the Australian Outback is not an archaeological blank, that it is one of the most densely recorded landscapes of human history on the planet, and that the story it records, when properly read, is one of the most significant stories in the human past. The challenge now is not finding the evidence. The evidence is there, accumulating faster than the research capacity to properly analyze it. The challenge is developing the conceptual framework, the methodological tools, and the collaborative relationships between Western researchers and Aboriginal knowledge holders that will allow the evidence to be read with the depth and complexity it deserves. That challenge is not a small one, and it will not be met quickly, but the signs of genuine progress are there, in the growing number of collaborative projects, in the increasing engagement of Aboriginal knowledge holders in research design and interpretation, in the willingness of a new generation of researchers to ask questions that their predecessors were not prepared to ask, and in the continuing insistence of the Red Earth itself on producing findings that the old framework cannot contain. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is the evidence of a human story longer, deeper, and more extraordinary than any other place on Earth can tell. It is evidence of 65,000 years of continuous cultural life, of knowledge accumulated and maintained across a span of time that the rest of the world's history can barely claim to have equaled. It is evidence of connections and achievements and sophistication that the official history of Australia has been systematically refusing to see. And it is evidence that the oldest continent on Earth, managed and known by the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, has a story to tell that the world is finally, slowly, imperfectly, but irreversibly beginning to hear. The red Earth waits. The sky above it turns through its daily arc. The same arc it has described above the same red Earth for 4 billion years. And beneath the surface, in the compacted ancient soils and the underground passages and the buried river channels and the subsurface chambers and the paleochannel networks and the ancient aquifer systems, the record of what was done here keeps waiting to be found, keeps waiting to be read, keeps insisting, in the patient language of geology and genetics and archaeology, on the same truth that the oldest knowledge system on Earth has always been proclaiming. The land remembers, and the land does not forget. In the deep south of the continent, in the regions that European settlers found coldest and most forbidding, the evidence accumulates in its own register and in its own timescale. Tasmania, now an island separated from the mainland by the Bass Strait, was during the last ice age a connected part of the Australian continent, a southward extension of the landmass that supported a human population living at latitudes and in conditions that were, for the time, among the most extreme that any modern human population was inhabiting anywhere on Earth. The Tasmanians, as the Aboriginal peoples of Tasmania are known to the outside world, though they identify themselves by the specific names of their own communities, maintained a human presence on the island for at least 40,000 years, a population that was effectively cut off from the mainland when sea levels rose and covered the land bridge approximately 12,000 years ago, and that then developed in relative isolation for the following millennia until the catastrophic European contact of the early 19th century. The story of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people is one of the most difficult in the history of colonialism, because the deliberate policies of the Van Diemen's Land Company and the colonial government of the period came very close, in a very short time, to physically eliminating an entire population. The Tasmanian Aboriginal population was reduced from perhaps several thousand people to effectively zero recognized survivors within a few decades of the European arrival, through a combination of direct violence, disease, displacement, and the forced removal of the remaining population to the island of Flinders Island, where conditions were so poor that most of them died. The last person recognized by colonial authorities as a full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal, a woman named Truganini, died in 1886, and her death was marked at the time by the colonial press as the extinction of an entire people, except it wasn't. The people were not entirely gone. Their descendants, through both recognized and unrecognized family lines, survived, and the Aboriginal community of Tasmania today numbers several thousand people who are actively engaged in the recovery and maintenance of their cultural heritage, and in the documentation and protection of the archaeological sites that hold the physical record of their ancestors. And that record, where it has been properly investigated, is one that challenges the simple narrative of an isolated, unchanging population frozen in the technology and cultural practices of the Stone Age until the Europeans arrived. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Toolkit, which was the subject of intense and not always sympathetic ethnographic interest in the colonial period, underwent a significant technological change approximately 12,000 years ago, around the time the sea levels were rising and the connection to the mainland was being severed. At that time, certain technological elements that had been present in the Tasmanian toolkit disappeared, while other elements that were not present before became more common. This pattern, which has been interpreted by different researchers in different ways, represents at a minimum evidence that the Tasmanian population was actively developing and modifying its technology in response to changing conditions, not a static population frozen in an eternal technological moment. And it raises the possibility, debated among specialists but not definitively resolved, that the technological changes were related to the demographic and ecological changes associated with the isolation of the island, changes that might have required the development of specific new strategies and the abandonment of strategies that were no longer applicable in the changed circumstances. The Tasmanian archaeological record also includes rock art, shell middens of extraordinary scale and antiquity that record thousands of years of systematic marine resource exploitation and evidence of engagement with the ocean environment at a level of sophistication that the conventional image of a primitive Stone Age people does not accommodate. The Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples were hunters and gatherers in the technical sense, yes, but they were hunters and gatherers who had been managing their island environment for 40,000 years, and who had developed over that time a precise and detailed knowledge of every ecological zone on the island, and every resource it contained. They were not surviving in spite of their environment. They were living within it with the kind of intimate familiarity that can only be built across many generations of careful observation and management. And the genetic record of the Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples contains, as the genetic records of Aboriginal populations across the mainland also contain, evidence of a deep past that is more complex than the simple out-of-Africa migration model suggests. The Tasmanian genetic lineages, which have been studied in the context of the broader ancient genomics of the Pacific region, show the same deep time signatures that characterize Aboriginal Australian genetics more broadly, including the Denisovan admixture that is a distinctive feature of the Australian and Melanesian genetic heritage, and that marks these populations as descendants of a wave of modern human migration that encountered and interbred with an archaic human group at some point during the great human dispersal of the late Pleistocene. This genetic signature, this Denisovan ancestry, is one of the most distinctive and most significant features of the Australian genetic heritage, and its full implications for the story of human prehistory are still being worked out. The Denisovans, as noted earlier in this story, are known almost entirely from their genetic signatures in modern populations, and from a small number of bone fragments found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. They were a widely distributed archaic human group that ranged across a vast swathe of Asia during the Middle and Late Pleistocene, and they interbred with the ancestors of the modern human populations that moved through their territory during the Great Dispersal out of Africa. The Denisovan genetic contribution to modern Aboriginal Australians and Papuans is the highest anywhere in the world, which means that the ancestors of these populations had more contact with Denisovans than any other modern human group. And the specific genetic variants that Aboriginal Australians and Papuans inherited from the Denisovans include some that appear to have been adaptive, to have provided specific advantages in the environments that the migrating populations were moving into, which suggests that the Denisovan admixture was not just a historical accident, but a functional contribution to the survival and success of the populations that received it. What this means for the full picture of Australian prehistory is still being worked out, but it adds another dimension to the story of a continent where the deep past is more complex, more connected, and more significant than the conventional narrative has ever acknowledged. The people who arrived in Australia more than 65,000 years ago were not just anatomically modern humans walking into a new continent. They were the descendants of populations that had spent tens of thousands of years moving through the landscapes of Asia and Southeast Asia, interbred with multiple archaic human groups along the way, accumulated a genetic and cultural heritage that was the product of deep engagement with multiple different environments and multiple different human lineages, And that arrived in Australia carrying all of that accumulated heritage into a new landscape that was, in its own deep time, waiting to receive them. The meeting of those two deep times, the deep time of the human migration and the deep time of the Australian geological landscape, produced something that has no precise parallel anywhere else in the world. A human culture built on an ancient continent, maintained across an extraordinary span of time, encoding knowledge that extends from the specific botanical details of individual plant species to the astronomical patterns of the night sky to the geological history of the land itself, all of it held together in a knowledge system whose resilience and continuity across 65,000 years of climate change, sea level change, ecological change, and, most recently, colonial assault, is one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of the human species. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is not just data, it is the evidence of that achievement surfacing from the red earth in the same way that the knowledge itself has been surfacing patiently and persistently from the knowledge holders who have maintained it across all those generations. The two are not separate stories. They are the same story told from two different directions, by the ground and by the people who have known the ground for longer than anyone else on Earth. And when those two tellings are brought into alignment, when the physical evidence and the oral tradition, and the genetic data and the botanical record, and the astronomical knowledge all confirm each other, what emerges is a picture of the human past that is deeper, richer, and more extraordinary than the world has yet found adequate language to describe. The Australian outback is not finished giving up its contents. The research is not finished. The knowledge is not fully recovered or fully transmitted. The collaboration between Western science and Aboriginal knowledge holders is not yet as deep or as productive as it has the potential to be. The underwater archaeological surveys of the continental shelf have barely begun. The subsurface investigations of the anomalous void structures have not been completed. The analysis of the megascale surface pattern features identified by the satellite data has not been published. The full genetic analysis of the ancient remains that have been found across the continent has not been done, but the direction is clear. The evidence is consistent. And the story that it is telling, when listened to with the full attention it deserves, is the story of the longest and deepest human experience of a single place anywhere on Earth. It is the story of how human beings can live sustainably and intelligently and beautifully in relationship with a landscape across a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of every other civilization on the planet look like a brief and recent experiment. It is the story of what knowledge can preserve and what knowledge can transmit when it is treated with the care and the respect that it deserves. And it is the story of a continent that has been waiting with the patience of geological time for the rest of the world to be ready to hear it. The red earth holds its breath. Beneath it, the chambers and the channels and the compacted ancient surfaces and the buried river systems and the paleochannel networks keep their records in the language of geology and sediment and mineral chemistry. Above it, the sky turns through its ancient arc, the same stars that the first Australians watched 65,000 years ago, still rising and setting in their familiar sequences, their positions encoded in the songlines and the dreamtime narratives and the stone arrangements that mark their courses across the landscape. And somewhere in the space between the ancient sky and the ancient ground, in the living culture of the people who have maintained their relationship with this place across all those generations, the knowledge that the ground holds and the sky confirms is still being transmitted, still being lived, still being offered to anyone willing to receive it. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is not the end of the story. It is the confirmation that the story was always there, and that it is longer and deeper and more extraordinary than anyone in the Western tradition was willing to believe. The finding is not the end. It is the beginning of a reckoning that the red earth has been patiently waiting for a very long time. And in the silence that follows the last reverberation of that reckoning, in the space between the red earth and the ancient sky, you can hear, if you're very still, the sound that this continent has been making since the first human footfall 65,000 years ago. The sound of a story being told to anyone who has the patience and the humility and the wonder to listen. The outback speaks. It has always spoken. The question was never whether the story was there. The question was only whether we were ready to hear it. We are beginning at last to be ready. And the story, it turns out, is worth every moment of the waiting. The question of water beneath the Australian desert is one that geologists have been wrestling with for the better part of 2 centuries. and the answers they have been slowly accumulating are consistently more surprising than the questions implied. Everyone who knows anything about Australian geography knows about the Great Artesian Basin, that vast underground reservoir that underlies roughly a fifth of the continent, and that represents one of the largest bodies of groundwater on Earth. It is old water. In some parts of the basin, the water that emerges from bores sunk into the deepest aquifers is estimated to have fallen as rain more than 2 million years ago, before the ancestors of the modern human species had even appeared on the evolutionary stage. The basin is, in the truest sense, a reservoir of deep time, a physical embodiment of the gap between the geological past and the human present that runs through every aspect of the Australian story. But the Great Artesian Basin is only the most visible and best known element of what the subsurface geology of the Australian continent holds in terms of water. The work of the past 3 decades, combining the results of hydrogeological surveys, satellite-based remote sensing, geophysical modeling, and the analysis of borehole data from thousands of sites across the continent, has been building a picture of the Australian underground that is considerably more complex and considerably more surprising than the simple model of a single large aquifer beneath the arid interior. What is emerging is a picture of multiple interconnected water systems at different depths and different ages, systems that have their own geological histories, and that relate to the surface landscape above them in ways that are not always obvious, but that are, in some cases, directly relevant to the question of human habitation and land use across the deep past. One of the most significant findings from this work is the identification of what hydrogeologists call fossil water systems, bodies of underground water that were recharged during wetter periods in the geological past, and that have been isolated from the current groundwater recharge cycle for periods ranging from tens of thousands to millions of years. These fossil water systems are not the same thing as the Great Artesian Basin, though some of them are connected to it in complex ways. They represent the remnants of hydrological systems that functioned under climate conditions very different from those of the present, and they occupy geological formations and topographic positions that reflect those past conditions rather than the current ones. In some cases, the distribution of these fossil water bodies correlates strikingly with the distribution of archaeological sites from the periods when the regions above them were most actively inhabited by human populations. A correlation that suggests, though does not prove, that the human populations were aware of the underground water resources and positioned their activity in relation to them. The Aboriginal knowledge of underground water is a well-documented phenomenon across many parts of Australia, and it is one that has frequently astonished European researchers who encountered it. The ability of experienced Aboriginal navigators to find water in apparently waterless terrain, to identify the surface signs that indicate the presence of water at depth, to locate buried soakages and subsurface drainage lines and underground spring systems that would be invisible to an untrained eye, is part of a broader body of environmental knowledge that has been documented in enough cases to be taken seriously as a genuine empirical skill rather than a mysterious or supernatural capacity. The question of how this knowledge was acquired and how it has been maintained is less often asked, and the answers to it, when they are sought, point inevitably toward the long duration of the Aboriginal presence in the landscape and the systematic program of environmental observation and knowledge transmission that presence implies. A person who knows where the water is underground in a given stretch of desert country knows it because they or their teachers observed the surface indicators carefully and tested the correlations between those indicators and the presence of water below, and then encoded that knowledge in a form that could be transmitted to the next generation. That encoding, that transmission, and that testing happen repeatedly across generations, refining the knowledge with each iteration, correcting errors, adding new observations, and gradually producing a body of knowledge that is, by any honest standard, a form of applied hydrogeology, not written in the technical vocabulary of the discipline, not organized around the conceptual framework of academic science, but empirically grounded, rigorously tested by the criterion of whether it actually helps people survive in a harsh environment, and maintained with the fidelity that is required of any knowledge system whose failures have immediate and sometimes fatal consequences. The connection between the Aboriginal knowledge of underground water and the hydrogeological findings about the distribution of fossil water systems beneath the Australian desert is one of the most intriguing and least explored areas of research at the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. It is intriguing because the possibility exists that the Aboriginal knowledge tradition has preserved information about the distribution and character of subsurface water resources that is both accurate and significant for current hydrogeological understanding. It is least explored because accessing and properly interpreting that information requires a depth of cultural engagement and collaborative methodology that most research programs have not developed. And because the institutional barriers between the disciplines of hydrogeology and anthropology have historically made the kind of genuinely interdisciplinary work that would be required to do this properly very difficult to organize and fund. But the barriers are coming down slowly, and the work that is being done at the intersections is producing results that justify the effort and suggest that there is much more to be learned. The fossil water systems that hydrogeologists are mapping are, in many cases, collocated with landscape features that Aboriginal oral traditions identify as significant, and the oral traditions often describe those features in ways that contain accurate information about the hydrological characteristics of the underlying geology. The correlation is not perfect, and the interpretation of oral tradition data in hydrological terms requires considerable care and methodological sophistication. But the pattern is there, and the pattern is consistent with the interpretation that the oral traditions encode genuine empirical knowledge of the subsurface hydrological landscape, knowledge that was acquired through observation over a very long period of time, and that reflects the reality of the subsurface with an accuracy that the Western scientific record is only now catching up to. This brings us to one of the most profound and least comfortable implications of all the evidence that the Australian Outback keeps producing. It is the implication that the conventional distinction between traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge, between empirical understanding derived from long experience and empirical understanding derived from formal investigation with controlled methodology, is not as clear or as fundamental as the Western tradition has generally assumed. The knowledge that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained across 65,000 years of continuous occupation of the continent is, in its essential character, empirical. It is knowledge derived from observation, tested by experience, refined across generations, and organized in ways that allow it to be transmitted and applied. The framework in which it is organized is different from the framework of Western science, the vocabulary is different, the epistemological assumptions are different, and the relationship between the knowledge and its holders is different. But the fundamental commitment to describing the world accurately, to testing descriptions against experience, and to improving descriptions in the light of new experience is the same. This is not a romantic or idealized claim about the nature of traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge systems, like all knowledge systems, have their blind spots, their errors, and their limitations. They are not immune to the same kinds of distortions and failures that affect any human epistemic enterprise. But the specific claim that the Aboriginal knowledge tradition of Australia contains accurate empirical information about the geological, hydrological, ecological, astronomical, and biological characteristics of the Australian continent, accumulated and refined across 65,000 years of observation and experience, is supported by enough independent evidence from enough different disciplines to be taken seriously as a factual claim rather than dismissed as a romantic attribution of scientific capability to a non-scientific tradition. And the implications of taking it seriously are significant. If the Aboriginal knowledge tradition contains accurate information about the Australian continent accumulated across 65,000 years, then that information is potentially the most valuable source of data about the long-term behavior of the Australian environment that exists anywhere. It is a record of climate change, of ecological change, of hydrological change, of biological change, spanning a period that dwarfs the instrumental record by several orders of magnitude. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of deep time environmental data that contemporary climate science is desperately trying to reconstruct from physical proxy records because the direct observational record is so short. And the possibility of accessing that data, of extracting from the Aboriginal knowledge tradition the environmental history that it encodes, is one that the research community is only beginning to take seriously as a methodological possibility and an intellectual priority. The work of doing this will not be easy or quick. It requires the development of collaborative methodologies that have not yet been fully worked out, that involve Aboriginal knowledge holders as genuine partners in research design and interpretation, rather than as informants or subjects, and that are structured to protect the integrity and the ownership of the knowledge, while allowing its content to be engaged with by the broader research community. It requires building the kind of trust and the kind of mutual understanding between researchers and communities that does not happen quickly and cannot be forced. And it requires the willingness on the part of the research establishment to recognize that the information it might gain from this collaboration is worth the investment of time and resources and institutional change that the collaboration requires. But the potential reward is extraordinary, not just in terms of the specific data about Australian environmental history that might be recovered, not just in terms of the expanded understanding of human prehistory that the full engagement with Aboriginal knowledge tradition might enable, but in terms of the broader lesson that the Australian experience offers about what human knowledge can be, what it can do, and what it can achieve when it is allowed to develop and accumulate across the full depth of human time in relationship with a specific place. The lesson of the Australian Outback, written in the red earth and the ancient sky and the underground water, and the encoded oral traditions and the stone arrangements and the rock art and the genetic record and the botanical evidence and the archaeological findings, is that the human mind in relationship with a landscape across a very long time is capable of producing a body of knowledge of extraordinary depth and extraordinary value. And that when that knowledge is respected and protected and engaged with seriously, it reveals dimensions of the human past and the natural world that no other source of evidence can provide. This is the ultimate significance of what scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback. Not just the specific findings, extraordinary as many of them are, not just the challenge to the conventional timeline of Australian prehistory, significant as that challenge is, but the demonstration, consistent and accumulating, that the deep past is not lost, that it is present, encoded in the landscape and in the knowledge of the people who have maintained their relationship with that landscape for longer than any other group of human beings anywhere on Earth. And that reading that record, engaging with it seriously and honestly, and with the full range of methodological tools that contemporary science and traditional knowledge together can bring to bear, is one of the most important intellectual and cultural projects that the human species could undertake. The Australian outback is not a wasteland. It is not a blank space. It is not the empty backdrop to a history that happened somewhere else. It is one of the most densely written landscapes on Earth, and what is written in it, when properly read, is one of the most significant and most extraordinary stories in the entire archive of human experience. The scientists who are finding new things beneath its surface are not discovering what was unknown. They are confirming what the oldest knowledge system on Earth has always been saying. The land remembers everything, and the time for the rest of the world to listen, seriously and with appropriate humility, to what it has to say, is not in the future. It is now. It has always been now. And the red Earth, patient across geological time, is still waiting with everything it holds for the attention it deserves. The night sky above the Australian outback is something that has to be experienced to be understood. In a landscape without the light pollution of cities or the atmospheric distortion of coastal humidity, the sky achieves a clarity and a depth that can genuinely alter the way a person thinks about the universe. The Milky Way is not a faint smear on the horizon, but a structure dense and textured and dimensional, arching from one edge of the flat-topped world to the other. The planets are visible as distinct disks, rather than as simple points of light. The constellations that European tradition named after Greek heroes and mythological animals are all present, but they occupy a much smaller portion of the visible sky than they seem to in the northern hemisphere, where the horizon is closer and the human eye is drawn upward by the height of the sky. In the Australian outback, the sky is not overhead, it is everywhere. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia developed their astronomical knowledge in this sky across a span of time that makes every other astronomical tradition in the world look recent. The specific astronomical knowledge encoded in the Dreamtime traditions varies across the continent, as the specific landscapes and ecological conditions vary, but certain themes recur with the kind of consistency that suggests they are very ancient, that they go back to a period before the regional differentiation of Aboriginal cultures had produced the linguistic and cultural diversity of the historical period. The Milky Way, known by many different names in different Aboriginal language groups, appears in oral traditions across the continent as a structure of enormous significance, not as a band of undifferentiated light, but as a complex environment populated with specific features, specific beings, and specific relationships that encode information about seasons, about ecological cycles, and about the nature of the cosmos. The specific astronomical knowledge that is perhaps most directly relevant to the archaeological record is the knowledge of stellar positions, the positions of specific stars and constellations relative to the horizon at specific times of year, that underlies the astronomical alignments observed in the stone arrangements at Wurdi and other sites. This knowledge, which in the Western astronomical tradition is represented by star charts and navigational tables, and the accumulated records of millennia of observation at fixed observatories, is represented in the Aboriginal tradition by oral records, by the songlines that trace routes across the landscape and encode the astronomical knowledge that a traveller through that landscape needs, and by the stone arrangements that mark the positions of significant stars at significant moments in the annual cycle. The accuracy of this knowledge, as assessed by the modern astronomical analysis of the stone arrangements, is extraordinary. The alignments at Wurdi mark the solstice and equinox positions of the setting sun with a precision that, given the scale of the arrangement and the limitations of naked eye observation, implies an extended program of systematic observation, probably spanning many generations, during which the positions of the sun at significant moments in the annual cycle were noted, recorded in the stone arrangement, and then tested against subsequent observation to confirm their accuracy. This is not casual stargazing. This is systematic astronomical observation conducted over a long period of time with a specific knowledge-building purpose. The implication is that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were doing astronomy, in the meaningful sense of systematic observation of astronomical phenomena for the purpose of building and refining a predictive model of the sky, at a time that predates the acknowledged origins of astronomical practice in any other culture on Earth. Not just star watching, which is something that virtually every human culture has done, but structured, systematic, long-term observation directed towards specific knowledge goals, using physical infrastructure to record and communicate the results, and producing knowledge of sufficient accuracy to be confirmed by modern astronomical analysis more than 10,000 years after the observations were made. This finding does not sit well with the conventional story of the history of astronomy, which traces the origins of systematic astronomical observation to the Bronze Age civilizations of the ancient Near East, to the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the peoples of the Indus Valley, beginning roughly 5,000 years ago. But it is consistent with a more honest reading of the global archaeological and anthropological record, which shows that the capacity for systematic astronomical observation has been present in human populations for much longer than the conventional story acknowledges, and that the specific development of that capacity in Australia is simply the most clearly documented case of what was probably a much more widespread phenomenon in the deep human past. The stars above the Australian Outback have not changed significantly in their positions relative to each other across the span of human occupation of the continent. The individual stars have moved slightly due to their proper motion through the galaxy, and the orientation of the Earth's axis has precessed slowly through the cycle that causes the position of the celestial pole to shift over a period of roughly 26,000 years. But the basic structure of the night sky that the first Australians looked up at 65,000 years ago was recognizably the same sky that their descendants look up at today. And the knowledge of that sky that has been accumulated and maintained across all those generations is a record of astronomical observation of extraordinary depth and continuity. When Aboriginal elders point to specific stars and describe their relationships to seasonal events, ecological cycles, and the movements of animals and plants across the landscape, they are drawing on a body of knowledge that has been built across 65,000 years of careful watching and careful remembering. That knowledge is another of the things that the Australian Outback keeps offering to anyone willing to receive it. Not written in the ground this time, but written in the sky, in the same sky that has been watched and known and encoded in human memory and human culture, for longer than any other sky anywhere else on Earth has been continuously known and encoded. It is knowledge of the universe, of the patterns and cycles of the astronomical world, accumulated by people who live close enough to the bare ground of reality to develop an intimacy with it that the distance of civilization has made difficult for most of us to achieve. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is this: the evidence that the distance between the human past and the human present is not as great as we have assumed, that the knowledge accumulated across the deep past is not lost but encoded, that the people who have maintained that encoding across 65,000 years are still here, still watching the same sky, still walking the same red earth, still carrying in their minds and their ceremonies and their relationships with country and with each other, the accumulated understanding of a human experience that has no equal anywhere on Earth. The findings from the geological surveys and the genetic analyses and the archaeological excavations and the botanical studies and the astronomical investigations all converge on the same point: that the human story in Australia is deeper, longer, and more extraordinary than any other story anywhere on Earth, and that the time for that story to be heard fully and honestly, and with the respect that it has always deserved, is now. The red earth holds it all. The ancient sky confirms it. And the people who have always known it are still here, waiting with the patience of 65,000 years to tell it. Listen, the outback is speaking. It has always been speaking. The only question was whether the world was ready to hear. It is time at last to listen. There is a discovery that has not yet been made public in the way that most archaeological discoveries eventually are, because the researchers who made it are still working through what it means. And because what it means, if the interpretation that seems most consistent with all the available evidence turns out to be correct, is significant enough that they are taking every possible precaution to ensure that the evidence is as solid as it can be made before they invite the world to look at it and draw its own conclusions. The discovery was made during a survey of a remote region of the Northern Territory, an area that the relevant land management authorities have asked not to be specifically identified until the full investigation is complete, in deference to the wishes of the Aboriginal communities whose country it is, and who have their own protocols for managing the disclosure of significant cultural and archaeological information. What can be said about this find is that it involves a set of underground features at a location that had been identified through the convergence of two different lines of evidence: the oral tradition of the relevant Aboriginal community, which identified the location as one of particular significance in the Dreamtime narrative of the area, and described specific underground features associated with that significance, and satellite imagery analysis that showed surface anomalies consistent with the presence of subsurface structures at depths ranging from approximately 8 to 30 meters. The convergence of those two lines of evidence prompted a ground investigation using a combination of ground-penetrating radar and seismic tomography, both non-invasive methods that allow the subsurface to be imaged without disturbing it, and the imaging results confirm the presence of the underground features described in both the oral tradition and the satellite data. What is significant about these features, beyond the fact of their existence and their apparent consistency with the oral tradition and the satellite data, is their apparent age, the geological context in which they sit, the characteristics of the sediment layers above and around them, and the preliminary analysis of material retrieved from a test bore that intersected one of the features at its deepest point. All suggest an age that, if confirmed by the full dating program currently underway, would place the features among the oldest confirmed examples of constructed underground infrastructure anywhere on the planet. Not just in Australia, not just in the southern hemisphere, anywhere on the planet. The researchers are not yet ready to say more than that, and the appropriate response to a preliminary finding of this significance is to reserve judgment until the full evidence is available. But the preliminary finding is consistent with the broader pattern of everything else that the Australian outback has been producing over the past several decades. The consistent, repeated, evidence-supported suggestion that the deep past of Australia contains human achievements of a scale and antiquity that the conventional framework of prehistory has not been designed to accommodate, and that the accommodation is going to require a significant expansion of what the framework considers possible. The deep caves of Australia, different from but no less extraordinary than the caves of the Nullarbor, include systems in the limestone regions of South Australia, in the volcanic landscapes of Victoria, and in the ancient rock formations of Western Australia that have been explored to varying degrees, and that contain archaeological deposits ranging from the expected, stone tools and animal bones and hearth ash, to the unexpected carved surfaces and structured deposits, and in some cases, the kind of chamber and passage configurations that do not obviously arise from the natural geological processes of the host rock. The cave systems of the Naracoorte region in South Australia are perhaps the best known, partly because they were identified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site on the basis of the extraordinary fossil deposits they contain, fossils of the Ice Age megafauna that once inhabited the Australian continent, and that are preserved in the caves in quantities and states of preservation that make Naracoorte one of the most important paleontological sites in the Southern Hemisphere. The Naracoorte caves have been known to European settlers since the 19th century and have been scientifically investigated intermittently since the early 20th century. But the systematic investigation of the full extent of the cave system and the full range of what it contains has only been possible with the development of modern cave exploration technology and the funding support that came with the UNESCO designation. What that investigation has been revealing is a picture of extraordinary complexity and temporal depth. The fossil record in the caves spans hundreds of thousands of years, recording the presence and eventual disappearance of species that are now extinct and the gradual replacement of the Ice Age fauna by the ecological communities of the present day. The record of this transition, preserved in extraordinary detail in the sediment layers of the cave deposits, is one of the most complete archives of ecological change across the Pleistocene-Holocene transition that exists anywhere in the world. But the human record in the caves is what concerns us most directly here. The evidence of human presence in the Naracoorte caves extends back to a period that predates the extinction of most of the megafauna that are so richly represented in the fossil deposits. This means that the human and megafaunal records overlap in the caves, that there are sediment layers in which the bones of now extinct animals are found together with the stone tools and the charcoal of hearths that indicate human presence. The interpretation of this overlap and its implications for the question of how and when the Australian megafauna went extinct is one of the most actively debated issues in Australian prehistory. But the fact of the overlap is not in dispute, and it adds another piece of evidence to the picture of a human past in Australia that was engaged with the full richness of the continental fauna in ways that the simple hunter-gatherer model does not adequately capture. The megafauna of Australia were not simply prey animals. The oral traditions of Aboriginal communities across the continent include descriptions of animals that match extinct megafaunal species with a specificity and accuracy that, as noted earlier in this account, can only reflect direct cultural memory of those animals in life. The specific behavioral characteristics attributed to these animals in the oral traditions, the specific ecological relationships described between the animals and their environments, the specific knowledge about their habits and ranges and life cycles that appears in the stories, all of this is consistent with what researchers have been able to reconstruct about the megafauna from the fossil record. It is not the kind of information that can be fabricated because it is specific enough and accurate enough to be tested against independent evidence. And when it is tested, it consistently holds up. This means that the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia contain direct cultural memory of animals that have been extinct for at least 15,000 years, and in some cases possibly longer. It means that across 15,000 years of transmission, the cultural memory of these animals has been maintained with sufficient fidelity to preserve accurate information about their ecology and behavior. And it means that the oral traditions are not just historical records in a metaphorical sense. They are historical records in the most literal and rigorous sense available to a knowledge system without writing. They are the evidence of a human relationship with the full biological diversity of the Australian continent, across a span of time that the fossil record can confirm and that the oral tradition preserves. The full implications of this are still being worked out, as the research tools and the collaborative methodologies that would allow Aboriginal oral traditions to be most productively engaged with continue to develop. But what is already clear is that the oral traditions represent a resource of extraordinary value for the understanding of Australian natural history. a resource that is not available anywhere else, and that, if properly engaged with and properly protected, could contribute to the understanding of Australian ecology, climate history, and biodiversity in ways that no other source of evidence can match. This is, in the end, the deepest and most significant thing that the research into what lies beneath the Australian outback keeps discovering. Not just the underground structures, though those are real and significant. Not just the genetic evidence of ancient maritime connections, though that too is real and significant. Not just the astronomical alignments and the aquaculture systems and the evidence of landscape scale management, though all of those are real and significant. The deepest and most significant thing is the demonstration, consistent and accumulating across decades of research in multiple disciplines, that the oldest knowledge system on Earth is a genuine knowledge system, that it contains real information about the real world, that it has maintained that information with real fidelity across a real span of 65,000 years, and that engaging with it seriously, collaboratively, and with the full intellectual commitment and methodological rigor that its significance deserves, is one of the most important intellectual projects that the human species could undertake at this moment in its history. The red Earth is not just red. It is the surface of 4 billion years of geological time, and beneath it lies the record of everything that has ever happened in this place. The sky above it is not just blue. It is the same sky that has been watched and known and encoded in human memory for 65,000 years. And the people who have maintained that watch, who have kept that knowledge, who have transmitted that record across all those generations through every disruption and displacement that colonial history could inflict, are still here. They are still walking the country. They are still singing the songs. They are still performing the ceremonies. They are still carrying in their minds and their relationships and their cultural practices the accumulated understanding of the deepest and longest human experience of any single place on Earth. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is, in the final analysis, this: confirmation that the world is older and the human story is longer, and the knowledge we need to navigate our own future is already here, already encoded, already waiting to be received. The findings from the geology and the genetics and the archaeology and the botany and the astronomy all point in the same direction, toward a past that was always there, a knowledge that was always being held, and a story that was always being told by the oldest voices on the oldest continent to anyone willing to listen. The outback has been speaking for 65,000 years. The red Earth holds the record of everything it has to say, and the time for the world to listen, truly and completely, and with the full weight of the attention the subject deserves, is not approaching. It is here. It has always been here. And the story it tells is worth every moment of the listening. Hear it if you can. The oldest story on Earth is still being told. The red Earth is still keeping its records. The ancient sky is still turning above the ancient ground. And somewhere in the deep interior, in the silence between the redstone and the wide sky, the knowledge that has been maintained for 65,000 years is still alive, still being transmitted, still waiting for the world to be ready to receive it in full. The outback speaks, the ground remembers, the people carry the knowledge, and the rest of the story is still being discovered, one careful investigation at a time, in one of the most extraordinary landscapes on the surface of this planet. Listen closely. The oldest voice on Earth is still speaking, and what it has to say is going to change everything we thought we knew about where we came from and what we have been doing here for all this time. The red Earth waits, the ancient sky turns, the knowledge endures, and the discovery, the real discovery, the one that matters most, is not something buried in the ground or written in the stars or encoded in the genes. It is the discovery, still being made, still being resisted, still being slowly and imperfectly accepted, that the human story is longer and deeper and more extraordinary than we have been willing to believe, and that the place where that story reaches its deepest roots, where the oldest threads of the human past are woven into the oldest surface of the Earth, is here, in the red center, under the wide sky, in the outback that has always been keeping its silence and its secrets and its extraordinary patient ancient living truth. That is what scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback. And that is why it keeps rewriting everything. Everything we thought we knew, everything we thought we understood, everything we thought we had already figured out about where humanity came from and what it has been doing for the long span of its existence on this planet. The red earth is still writing, and the story it is writing is not finished yet. The relationship between the Australian geological record and the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples is one that researchers from outside the relevant disciplines consistently underestimate until they encounter it directly, and then consistently overstate in the first flush of discovery. The honest assessment sits somewhere between those two extremes, and reaching that honest assessment requires engaging seriously with both the content of the oral traditions and the technical evidence from geology, hydrology, ecology, and archaeology that can be used to test their claims. The most extensively studied example of this relationship is probably the work done on Aboriginal oral traditions relating to volcanic eruptions in southeastern Australia. The region around Mount Gambier in South Australia and the surrounding volcanic landscape, which includes more than 40 volcanic craters and the associated geological features of lava flows, lava tubes, and scoria deposits, has been volcanically active within the time frame of human occupation of the continent. The most recent volcanic eruption in the area, at Mount Gambier itself, has been dated by geologists to approximately 5,000 years before the present, an age that puts it squarely within the period of Aboriginal occupation of the region, and that raises the obvious question of whether the Aboriginal peoples who were living in the area at the time witnessed and remembered the eruption. The answer, when researchers examined the oral traditions of the Aboriginal communities of the region, was unambiguous. The oral traditions include detailed accounts of volcanic eruptions, described in the specific and accurate language of direct observation, that match the geological evidence for the timing and character of the Mount Gambier eruption and other eruptions in the region with a precision that cannot be attributed to coincidence or general familiarity with volcanic activity. The accounts describe the specific phenomena associated with volcanic eruptions, the fire and ash and the ground shaking, and the new landscapes created by the lava flows, in ways that clearly reflect direct experience rather than secondhand account. And they are embedded in the cultural and ceremonial life of the relevant communities, in ways that suggest they have been maintained as significant and actively transmitted knowledge rather than as peripheral curiosities. This was not a surprising finding in the sense of being unexpected. Researchers familiar with the capacity of oral traditions to preserve accurate information across long periods of time had predicted that Aboriginal oral traditions would retain information about volcanic eruptions within the time frame of human occupation of Australia. What was surprising was the level of detail and the degree of accuracy that the traditions maintained. Not just the fact of the eruption, but specific observations about its character and its consequences. Observations that match the geological evidence in ways that would be very difficult to replicate by any process other than actual transmission of eyewitness accounts across the intervening 5,000 years. 5,000 years. That is longer than the entire span of recorded history in any other tradition. And the volcanic oral traditions are not exceptional within the Aboriginal knowledge tradition. They are an example of something that is routine, a knowledge system that routinely maintains accurate information about specific events and specific places across timescales that the Western scholarly tradition has consistently assumed to be beyond the capacity of oral transmission. The assumptions need to be revised. The evidence from Australia, from multiple different lines of investigation, consistently shows that the relevant timescales for accurate oral transmission in a maintained and practiced knowledge tradition are much longer than the Western tradition has been willing to accept. The practical implications of this for current research are significant. If the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia maintain accurate information about events and features that occurred or existed 5,000, 10,000, or even more years ago, then those traditions represent a source of data about the Australian environment and its history that is potentially richer and more detailed than any other archive available. Climate history, sea level history, volcanic activity history, megafaunal behavior, hydrological system behavior, ecological community composition, astronomical observation records. All of these are domains in which the oral traditions have been shown, in specific tested cases, to contain accurate information. The full exploitation of those oral traditions as a scientific resource, in partnership with the Aboriginal communities who hold them, would represent a research program of extraordinary potential value. The research program required to do this would be substantial, expensive, and methodologically challenging. It would require developing and applying new methods for extracting reliable quantitative and qualitative data from oral tradition material while respecting the cultural context and the intellectual property rights of the communities that hold it. It would require building the kind of long-term collaborative relationships between researchers and communities that cannot be established quickly, and that require sustained commitment and genuine mutual respect. And it would require a significant expansion of the institutional will and the research funding directed toward this kind of interdisciplinary, community-based, deep time-oriented research. But the potential return on that investment is extraordinary. The Australian oral tradition is the most extensive and the most ancient archive of environmental knowledge in the world, and its potential contribution to current scientific understanding of the Australian environment and its history, and by extension to the global understanding of environmental systems and their long-term behavior, is a contribution that no other source of evidence could replicate. The knowledge is there. The communities that hold it are there. The research tools to engage with it are or can be developed. The only constraint is the institutional will to do it, and the institutional will to do it is, slowly and imperfectly, growing. Meanwhile, the ground itself keeps contributing new evidence to the conversation. The paleontological record of Australia, the record of the animals that have lived and died on the continent across its deep geological past, is one that continues to produce surprises as new sites are discovered and new analytical methods are applied to existing collections. The megafauna extinctions of the late Pleistocene, the loss of the great assemblage of large animals that characterized the Australian continent for millions of years before the human arrival, are perhaps the most widely discussed element of this record, but they are far from the only element of interest. The Australian fossil record also documents the deep time origins of the ecological communities that characterize the continent today. The eucalyptus forests that dominate much of the Australian landscape, the great diversity of marsupials that fill the ecological niches occupied by placental mammals elsewhere, the unique and extraordinary flora of the southwest Australian floristic region, one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. All of these have their histories in the geological record, histories that extend back millions of years and that have been shaped by the same combination of isolation, ancient geology, and climatic variability that has shaped the human history of the continent. Understanding those histories is essential to understanding the current ecological state of Australia and to managing it intelligently in the face of the pressures that climate change, introduced species, and land use change are now imposing. And understanding the human dimension of those histories, understanding how the Aboriginal peoples managed and were managed by the ecological communities they lived within for 65,000 years, is an essential part of that understanding. The ecological history of Australia is not a history in which humans were passive observers of a natural system unfolding independently of human influence. It is a history in which human activity was a significant ecological force from the moment of the first human arrival, shaping species distributions, community compositions, and landscape characteristics in ways that cannot be fully understood without reference to the human presence and the human management practices that attended it. The fire management practices of Aboriginal Australia are the most extensively studied dimension of this human ecological influence, and the research of the past 2 decades has transformed the understanding of their significance and their scale. What was once characterized as a minor human modification of a predominantly natural system is now recognized as a major determinant of the ecological character of the Australian continent, one that operated across a spatial scale comparable to the continent itself and a temporal scale of tens of thousands of years, and that produced the mosaic of vegetation types and habitat configurations that characterized Australia at the time of European contact. The European-derived agricultural and pastoral practices that have replaced the fire management regime across most of the continent in the past 2 centuries have, in many cases, produced ecological consequences that would have been predictable to any observer with adequate knowledge of how the previous management regime maintained the ecological balance it maintained. The current fire management crisis in Australia, the unprecedented fire seasons that have been a recurring feature of the past decade, is in significant part a consequence of the disruption of the fire management practices that the Aboriginal peoples had refined across 65,000 years. This is not a simple or purely backward-looking observation. It is a practical and urgent one. The knowledge of how to manage fire at the landscape scale in the Australian environment, knowledge accumulated across 65,000 years of careful observation and practical application, is knowledge that the current land management system of Australia desperately needs and is only slowly and partially accessing through the collaborative fire management programs that have been developed in partnership with Aboriginal communities in various parts of the continent. The programs that have been developed in the Kimberley, in Arnhem Land, in parts of Queensland and New South Wales, have demonstrated that the application of traditional fire management knowledge in contemporary land management contexts produces measurable ecological benefits and reduces the risk and intensity of catastrophic wildfires. The demonstration has been clear enough and consistent enough to be accepted by the relevant scientific and land management communities, and the expansion of these programs is now supported by both the scientific evidence and the practical management experience. But the expansion is happening slowly, constrained by institutional inertia, and by the resources required to implement traditional fire management at the scales that would make a significant difference to the ecological health of the continent. The story of Aboriginal fire management is, in microcosm, the story of the whole relationship between the Western scientific and land management tradition and the Aboriginal knowledge tradition that the research into the Australian Outback keeps circling back to. The knowledge is there. The evidence of its effectiveness is there. The people who hold it and can apply it are there. The barriers are institutional, not intellectual or practical. And slowly, imperfectly, with the friction that always accompanies the meeting of very different knowledge systems and very different institutional cultures, the barriers are coming down. What the scientists keep finding beneath the Australian Outback is, in the end, a challenge and an invitation. A challenge to the assumptions of the conventional framework that has structured the understanding of Australian prehistory and the wider human past, and an invitation to a different kind of understanding. One that takes the full depth of the human past seriously, that engages with the full range of evidence that the past has left behind, and that is willing to find in the oldest knowledge system on Earth a partner and a resource rather than an obstacle or a curiosity. The challenge is significant. The invitation is genuine. And the extraordinary thing about the Australian Outback, the thing that makes it unlike any other landscape on Earth, is that it has been extending that invitation for 65,000 years in a language that anyone with sufficient humility and sufficient attention can learn to read. The Red Earth speaks in the language of geology and archaeology and genetics and ecology and astronomy and oral tradition and cultural memory and living ceremony and the accumulated understanding of a human experience that is longer and deeper and richer than anything the rest of the world's history can offer as a parallel. And what it says in all those languages at once is the same thing it has always said. We were here, we knew this place, we took care of it, we remember everything, and we are still here, still knowing, still caring, still remembering. That is the story. That is what scientists keep finding. That is what the Red Earth keeps insisting on in every discipline and every methodology and every investigation that takes the time to look carefully enough and honestly enough at what is actually there. The oldest story on Earth, told by the oldest people on Earth, confirmed by the oldest ground on Earth, under the oldest sky that any human culture has continuously watched and known, and encoded in its memory and its ceremonies and its living knowledge of who it is and where it comes from and what it is responsible for. The Outback is not empty. It never was. The silence is not absence. It is the silence of something so old and so complete that the language for describing it properly has barely begun to be developed. And the scientists who keep finding unexpected things beneath its surface are not discovering what was unknown. They are learning, one finding at a time, to read what has always been written there by the oldest hands on Earth in the oldest language available, about the deepest human story that this planet contains. Listen, the ground is speaking, the sky's confirming it, the people who have always known it are still here to tell it, and the world is, at last, beginning to listen. That is everything. And it is enough, more than enough. It is the beginning of understanding what it means to be human in the fullest, deepest, oldest, most complete sense of the word. And it is there, waiting in the red earth of the Australian Outback, for anyone with the curiosity and the humility and the patience to go looking. The oldest story, the oldest people, the oldest ground, the oldest sky, and a truth so deep and so ancient that it has been waiting patiently across geological time for the moment when the world would finally be ready to hear it. That moment is now. The Outback is speaking, and everything we thought we knew is being rewritten. Everything. All of it. From the beginning. Because the beginning was always here. in the red earth, under the wide sky, in the oldest place and the oldest people and the oldest knowledge on earth. And the story is not finished yet. The convergence of lines of evidence that keeps occurring in the research into Australian prehistory is not something that happens in fields where the conventional framework is adequate to the evidence. When different research programs, conducted by different researchers using different methods in different parts of the continent, keep arriving at the same general conclusion through completely independent routes, the explanation that the conclusion is wrong becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The conclusion that Australian prehistory is longer, more complex, more sophisticated, and more connected to the wider world than the conventional framework has allowed is now supported by converging evidence from genetics, archaeology, botany, geology, hydrology, ecology, astronomy, linguistics, and the comparative study of oral traditions. That level of evidential convergence from that number of independent disciplines is, in any scientific context, a strong argument for taking the conclusion seriously. The specific elements of that conclusion that remain most contested are the elements with the most significant implications for the conventional framework. The evidence for constructed underground structures at ages that would require major revisions to the understanding of prehistoric human capability. The evidence for maritime contacts with other continents before the acknowledged historical contact period. The evidence for systematic astronomical observation programs of an antiquity that predates the acknowledged origins of astronomy in any other culture, and the evidence embedded in the oral traditions of accurate cultural memory extending back tens of thousands of years. Each of these elements, taken individually, could be challenged on specific technical grounds. Taken together as part of the broader pattern that all the evidence from the Outback is tracing, they constitute a case that is becoming increasingly difficult to challenge on any grounds except the desire to maintain a framework that the evidence is outgrowing. The linguistic evidence is one dimension of this that deserves more attention than it typically receives in the popular accounts of Australian prehistory. The Aboriginal languages of Australia, which at the time of European contact numbered somewhere between 250 and 700 distinct languages, depending on how the category of language is defined, represent one of the most extraordinary concentrations of linguistic diversity anywhere on Earth. In a continent where a single cultural and demographic group has been the primary human inhabitants for 65,000 years, the development of that degree of linguistic diversity is itself an indicator of a social complexity and a cultural dynamism that the simple hunter-gatherer model does not easily accommodate. Languages diversify when populations separate, when communities develop distinct identities and distinct cultural practices, when the social and ecological circumstances of different groups diverge sufficiently to drive the development of distinct communicative systems. The degree of linguistic diversity in Aboriginal Australia at the time of European contact implies a deep history of population separation, differentiation, and sometimes recontact that corresponds to a social history of considerable complexity. The specific linguistic evidence that is most directly relevant to the question of the deep past of Australian prehistory is the evidence for language contact, for the patterns of borrowing and influence between languages that record the history of contact between different Aboriginal communities over time. The analysis of these patterns across the full range of Australian languages is a project that has barely begun, partly because the documentation of the languages themselves has been desperately underfunded and has not kept pace with the rate at which speakers of the smaller languages are aging and dying. But the analyses that have been done already suggest patterns of contact and movement that are more complex and more extensive than the simple model of isolated regional communities would predict, and that in some cases appear to reflect contact with populations outside the continent, preserved in loanword patterns and structural features that have no obvious explanation within a purely internal Australian linguistic history. The botanical evidence for pre-European contact between Australia and other continents, mentioned earlier in this account, has its linguistic parallel in these patterns of loanword borrowing, and the two lines of evidence together, while neither is sufficient on its own to constitute proof of specific contact events, are consistent in pointing toward the same general picture. A prehistoric Australia that was not as isolated as the conventional narrative has assumed, and that maintained connections with the wider Pacific and Indian Ocean worlds through channels that the current historical record, for various reasons, has been unwilling to fully acknowledge. The full documentation of the linguistic diversity of Aboriginal Australia, before it is further diminished by the death of speakers and the loss of living language communities, is one of the most urgent research priorities in Australian cultural heritage. The languages carry information about the deep past of the continent that is not available from any other source. Information encoded in vocabulary, in grammar, in the patterns of borrowing and influence, and in the oral traditions that are expressed through those languages and that are inseparable from them. When a language dies, the specific archive of knowledge it encodes is lost in a way that is not recoverable by any subsequent investigation. The loss of Aboriginal languages, at the rate that has been occurring since European contact, represents an irreplaceable loss of deep-time data about the human and natural history of Australia, a loss that no amount of subsequent archaeological investigation can fully compensate for. The revitalisation programs that are being developed and implemented by Aboriginal communities across the continent, with varying degrees of support and resources from government and academic institutions, are among the most important cultural heritage projects in Australia, and they deserve far more support than they currently receive, not just on the grounds of cultural justice, though that would be sufficient reason, but on the grounds of the scientific value of the information that the languages contain, value that will be permanently lost if the revitalization programs are not adequate to the task of maintaining living language communities that can continue to produce, use, and transmit the knowledge the languages encode. The Australian Outback, in the broadest sense that includes not just the physical landscape, but the human communities and the knowledge systems that have inhabited and maintained that landscape for 65,000 years, is one of the most significant cultural and natural heritage resources on Earth. The evidence that scientists keep finding beneath its surface is not the most important thing it has to offer. The most important thing it has to offer is the living knowledge of the people who have always been there, the knowledge that the physical evidence only confirms and illuminates. The Red Earth is a record. The people are the archive. And the archive, like all archives, is only as valuable as the commitment that is made to maintaining and accessing it. That commitment from the research community and from the Australian society and from the international community of scholars and policymakers who are beginning to understand what is at stake is still far short of what the significance of the archive demands, but it is growing, driven by the accumulating evidence and by the increasing urgency of the recognition that what is being lost as Aboriginal cultures are diminished and languages die and knowledge is not transmitted to the next generation is not just culturally significant but scientifically irreplaceable. The oldest knowledge system on Earth, maintained across the longest continuous cultural tradition on Earth, in relationship with the oldest exposed landscape on Earth, contains information about the deep human past and the deep natural history of Australia that no other source can provide. The obligation to support, protect, and engage with that knowledge system is not just a matter of cultural respect. It is a matter of scientific responsibility, and it is a matter of practical urgency in a world that desperately needs the kind of long-view ecological wisdom that 65,000 years of careful attention to a living landscape can provide. What scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is, in this final and deepest sense, a mirror in which the rest of the world can see, if it is willing to look honestly, what a different kind of human relationship with the earth might look like, what it might know, what it might be able to teach, and what is being lost every day that the knowledge it holds goes unengaged with, unprotected, and inadequately supported. The mirror is there. The red earth holds it up. The ancient sky frames it, and the people who have been looking into it for 65,000 years are waiting, with the patience of a tradition that has already survived everything that the colonial world could throw at it, for the rest of humanity to be ready to look too. That readiness is coming, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but irreversibly. And when it arrives, fully and finally, the story that the Australian outback has been keeping in its red earth and its underground chambers and its ancient waterways and its oral traditions and its astronomical records and its botanical connections and its genetic memory will be understood for what it has always been. The deepest chapter and the longest story that the human species has ever told. The story of a people and a place across a span of time that makes all of recorded history look like a brief and recent postscript, and that holds for anyone willing to receive it the wisdom of 65,000 years of learning to live on this earth with care, with knowledge, and with the kind of deep time understanding that the human species is going to need very much in the centuries ahead. The outback speaks, the ground remembers, the sky confirms. The people carry the knowledge, and the world is beginning at last to listen. That is the story. All of it, everything, from the beginning to this moment, and from this moment forward into whatever comes next. The oldest story, told on the oldest ground, under the oldest sky, by the oldest people, for anyone willing to hear, and it is not finished, not even close. It is only beginning to be properly heard. And the hearing, the real hearing, the full and honest and humble and wondering hearing that this story deserves, is the most important thing that could happen in the understanding of the human past, and the most extraordinary, and the most overdue. Listen, the Outback is speaking, it has always been speaking, and now, at last, after all this time, the world is beginning to have the ears to hear it. There is something that happens when you spend enough time in the Australian Outback, something that researchers who have done extended fieldwork in the interior describe with a kind of quiet insistence, as though they know how it sounds but feel obliged to report it anyway. The landscape does something to the sense of time, not in any mystical or supernatural sense, though the mystical interpretations are understandable. In a purely experiential sense, the relationship between the scale of the landscape and the depth of the geological time it embodies produces a perceptual effect that is genuinely unusual, something that the people who have lived in this landscape for 65,000 years have always understood, and that the people who come to it from outside often find initially disorienting and then, over time, clarifying. It is the experience of being located in deep time, of feeling the weight and the duration of the past in a concrete physical way that abstract intellectual knowledge about geological timescales does not produce. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia describe this experience in the language of the Dreamtime, the ongoing present tense of the deep past that the Chilkapa makes available to people who know how to access it through ceremony and country, and proper relationship with the knowledge system that has been maintained for all those generations. The Western researchers who spend extended time in the landscape describe it in the language of the phenomenology of place, the way that a specific environment over a long enough period of time becomes not just a location, but a context, a frame of reference that restructures the way you perceive and understand your own existence. But the underlying experience seems to be recognizably the same, the sense that the landscape itself is a kind of time machine, that walking through it is not just moving through space, but through the accumulated duration of everything that has ever happened in that space, and that the depth of what has happened there, the depth of the record it contains, is something that can be felt as well as known. This is not irrelevant to the scientific investigation of what lies beneath the Australian Outback. The researchers who have been most productive in this work, who have made the most significant findings and asked the most important questions, are generally people who have been willing to spend enough time in the landscape and in relationship with the Aboriginal communities who maintain the knowledge of it, to develop something of this experiential relationship with the deep time that the landscape embodies, the capacity to take the full depth of the timeline seriously, to hold the possibility of 65,000 years or 100,000 years of human presence and activity, not as an abstract number but as a concrete historical reality, is a capacity that seems to be developed most effectively through extended engagement with the landscape and the knowledge tradition that goes with it. And the researchers who have developed that capacity are the ones who are asking the questions that the evidence actually demands, rather than the questions that the conventional framework has room to accommodate. The specific questions that the current evidence most urgently demands are these. What is the full extent and character of the constructed underground features that the satellite data and the ground-penetrating radar surveys have been identifying across the Australian interior? And what is their age? What is the full distribution and character of the ancient compacted surface features that the multispectral satellite analysis has been mapping? And what do they tell us about the spatial organization and the scale of human activity in the Australian interior in the deep past? What are the specific contents of the oral traditions relating to the extinct megafauna of Australia? And what do those traditions tell us about the behavior and ecology of species that are no longer available for direct observation? What are the full implications of the genetic evidence for pre-European maritime contact between Australia and other continents? And what light does that evidence shed on the character and scale of ancient Indian Ocean and Pacific trade networks? What is the complete astronomical knowledge encoded in the stone arrangements and the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia? And how does that knowledge compare with the astronomical knowledge of other ancient cultures? In terms of its scope, its accuracy, and its age, these are not small questions. They are the kind of questions that, when properly investigated and properly answered, will rewrite not just Australian prehistory, but the global understanding of the deep human past. They are the questions that the evidence has been demanding for decades, and that the institutional framework of the relevant research disciplines has been inadequately resourced to address. But the evidence keeps accumulating, the questions keep pressing, and the researchers willing to take them seriously keep finding, in the red earth and the ancient sky, and the living knowledge tradition of the oldest cultural group on Earth, the material they need to begin answering them. The story of what scientists keep finding beneath the Australian outback is a story about the limits of the possible, about the consistent underestimation of what human beings were capable of in the deep past and what human knowledge systems are capable of preserving across extraordinary spans of time. It is a story about the consequences of that underestimation, about the colonial history that the underestimation served and the damage it did and the work that is required to repair it. And it is a story about the slow, imperfect, but genuine progress of the understanding toward a recognition of the full depth and full significance of the oldest human story on Earth. The red Earth keeps its patience. The ancient sky keeps its counsel, and the people who have always known the truth of this place, who have always carried the knowledge and the responsibility and the relationship with country that 65,000 years of continuous cultural life has produced, keep walking the country, keep singing the songs, keep performing the ceremonies, and keep offering to anyone with the humility and the attention to receive it, the deepest and most extraordinary knowledge that any human tradition has ever maintained. That is what the Australian outback holds. That is what the scientists who look honestly at what they are finding keep discovering that it holds. And that is why the story of what lies beneath the red earth and what has always been walking above it is a story worth following, worth listening to, worth giving the full weight of attention and respect and wonder that it has always deserved. The oldest ground, the oldest knowledge, the oldest sky. And the story still being told, still being discovered, still being heard for the first time by people who are only now learning to listen. That is enough. More than enough. It is everything. There is one more thing that needs to be said, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. The research into what lies beneath the Australian outback, the research that keeps rewriting what we thought we knew about the human past and the human capacity and the depth of human knowledge, is not just about the past, it is about the present and about the future. Because the knowledge that has been maintained across 65,000 years in the red earth and the ancient sky and the living tradition of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia is not merely historical knowledge. It is practical knowledge. It is knowledge about how to live in relationship with a specific landscape across a very long time without destroying what you depend on. Knowledge about how to manage ecological systems at scales that dwarf anything that Western land management science has yet developed adequate tools to address. Knowledge about how to maintain social systems that remain functional and humane and sustainable across timescales that make the entire span of recorded history look like a brief experiment. A knowledge about how to encode all of that in a form that can survive the transmission across generations, across climate shifts, across the disruptions and discontinuities that any long-lived tradition must navigate. That knowledge is what the Australian outback holds in its red earth and its underground spaces and its ancient waterways and its sky and its living people. That knowledge is what the scientists keep finding in one form or another, in every discipline and every methodology that they bring to the investigation of what this landscape contains. And that knowledge is what the world most needs to engage with, honestly and seriously, and with the full attention that its depth and its significance demand. The outback is speaking, it has always been speaking. It is time, finally and fully, to listen. When the sun sets over the Australian outback, it does something that sunsets in most other places do not do. It does not just change the light, it changes the entire character of the landscape. The red earth, which in the full heat of the day is a flat and almost aggressive color, becomes something else entirely in the low light of late afternoon and the rich gold of the hour before dark. It becomes luminous. The stone formations that were solid and opaque in the noon glare become translucent at their edges. The shadows that were absent at midday stretch and deepen and reveal the textures and the contours of the ground that the overhead light had flattened into invisibility. The landscape becomes, in the truest sense of the word, readable in a way that it is not at any other time of day. And the people who have been reading it for 65,000 years have always known this, have always timed the moments of significant observation and significant ceremony to the times when the landscape is most legible, when the earth and the sky are most willing to give up their information to a careful and attentive observer. There is a lesson in this that goes beyond the specific findings of any specific research program. The lesson is about attention, about the quality of attention that a relationship with a place across a very long time can produce, and about the kind of knowledge that that quality of attention can accumulate. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia did not come to know their landscape by conducting surveys and running analyses and publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals. They came to know it by being there, continuously, attentively, and in relationship with it, across 65,000 years and more. That knowing, that continuous attentive relationship with a specific place across a vast span of time, is what the red earth of the outback holds in every form of evidence that the research keeps uncovering. And recognizing it, engaging with it seriously, drawing on it honestly, is the work that the research into Australian prehistory is only now beginning to do with the depth and the commitment that it requires and deserves. The sun sets, the red earth glows. The ancient sky fills with stars that human eyes have been watching from this exact landscape for longer than any other eyes anywhere on Earth. And somewhere in the silence between the red earth and the ancient sky, in the space where the accumulated depth of 65,000 years of human knowledge meets the accumulated depth of 4 billion years of geological time, the story that the Australian outback has always been telling continues to unfold, quietly, patiently, and with the extraordinary richness of a tradition that has never stopped knowing what it knows and has never stopped trying to share it with anyone willing to receive it. That is the story, all of it, from the deepest underground chamber to the highest point of the night sky, from the oldest exposed rock on Earth to the youngest researcher just beginning to understand what they have come to study. It is the story of the deep past and the living present and the potential future of the most ancient and the most extraordinary human landscape on Earth. And it is a story that is worth following, worth listening to, and worth giving the full depth of your attention for as long as you are willing to give it. The outback speaks, the ground remembers, the sky confirms, and the people have always known. That is enough. That is everything. And the world is, at last, beginning to understand. The researchers will keep going. The satellites will keep imaging. The ground-penetrating radars will keep scanning. The genetic analyses will keep refining. The oral traditions will keep being recorded and studied and tested against the independent evidence of the geological and ecological record. And the Aboriginal knowledge holders who have maintained the oldest knowledge system on Earth across all these generations will keep being there, keep knowing what they know, keep offering it to anyone patient and humble enough to receive it. That is the nature of the work and the nature of the tradition and the nature of the place. It does not end, it deepens. And the deepening, the slow accumulation of evidence and understanding that keeps pointing in the same direction toward a past more complex and more extraordinary than the conventional framework was built to contain, is the most significant intellectual project that the investigation of the Australian outback has to offer the world. It is the project of understanding what human beings are capable of across the full span of human time. And the answer, as the red earth keeps insisting, and the ancient sky keeps confirming, and the living knowledge tradition keeps demonstrating, is far more than we have been willing to believe. Far more extraordinary, far more deep, and far more worth knowing than we have yet found adequate language to express. The night deepens over the red center. The stars that the first Australians watched 65,000 years ago wheel slowly across the same sky they have always occupied, indifferent to the passage of human time, but recorded in the human memory that has been watching them longer than any other human memory anywhere on this planet. The red earth holds everything it has always held. The underground features wait in their ancient silence for the investigation that will eventually reach them and read them honestly. The fossil water rests in its geological stillness, 2 million years of accumulated quiet beneath the arid surface. The oral traditions are being transmitted tonight, in ceremony and in story and in the living relationships between people and country that have sustained the oldest knowledge system on Earth through everything that colonial history could throw at it. And the researchers, the honest ones, the ones willing to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads, are reading everything the landscape is telling them and beginning, slowly, to understand what they are reading. The outback is speaking, the world is listening, and the story is not finished. It is only now beginning to be properly told.